If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What was the scariest and most frightening supernatural being or paranormal encounter you have had or heard of?
I grew up near a cemetery. The cemetery was about a block away from my house, and it had a large playhouse-type building called the hall at the edge where people would rent it out for parties. Weird place to host parties. My aunt and I had a cleaning job cleaning the building after events. We would go at 4 a.m. and clean. One morning, someone threw a massive Halloween party, and it was trashed. There was a stage in the building that they blocked off with butcher paper. We went on the stage to remove it. The stage faced the front entrance of the building. We were on the stage behind the paper to pull it down. Since we were behind it, we couldn't see the front door. As we started to pull one side down, the front door, which was locked, all of a sudden swung open, and the most massive gust of wind blew the paper toward us. At the same time, we heard something running across the entire hall and towards the backstage stairs where we were. We were frozen in terror, thinking someone was breaking in and we were about to be murdered. We sat there as still as possible, listening. Nothing. No more sounds and footsteps. We finally got brave enough to slowly creep down the stairs. To our shock, there was nothing there, and the front door was still locked. We noped out of there fast and waited till light to finish the job. I stopped going after that. It scared the hell out of me. I live next to a massive cemetery in Washington state. It is all flat, has water features, statues, sitting areas, a crematorium that recently burnt to the ground and the brick walls collapsed in a fire this February, and the like. The cemetery is well kept except for leaky water pipes everywhere that flood the graves constantly. Maintenance does a shoddy fix, and it leaks and leaks elsewhere weeks later. I walk the entire cemetery once or twice a week. I've seen and heard unusual things over the 8 years I've walked here. One time, my friend and I were cutting through to get to my place at around 9 p.m. It's not well lit, but we could see. We heard multiple people at once whisper out of nowhere, something we couldn't make out. It made us both stop and ask one another what the duck we just heard. We tried to listen but didn't hear a thing. We continued down the path, and were about 25 feet away from the start of a public sidewalk and the end of the cemetery. We heard the whistling begin. It was loud, not a jovial tune, and came out of nowhere. We were knees to chest running to the sidewalk when we heard something run past us running on the sidewalk. Sounded like flip-flops on pavement running. We made it to my house, trying hard not to outright scream the entire way. Another instance of something happening at that cemetery was when I was walking the paths. This place is entirely flat, and you can see anyone who visits. I'm walking my dog, and I see a toddler running down in between the graves and disappearing behind an electrical box 15 feet away from me with no one anywhere near our vicinity. I immediately run with my dog, thinking it's a loose child, and see not a living thing anywhere. The weirdest supernatural encounter I had was the little boy on my kitchen sink. I was around 8 years old, and my room was originally a den, so it was a big open space kind of in the middle of the double-wide mobile home we lived in. This room was next to the kitchen, and where my bed lay, I could clearly see my kitchen sink and counter space. Most nights my mom would leave the light above the sink on, because I was afraid of the dark. One night I woke up in the middle of the night, and when I rolled over in my bed, I saw a pale boy in what looked like ragged, oversized clothes and wet from head to toe, sitting on my kitchen sink, and he looked like he was screaming at me, but I couldn't hear him. I could see him clear as day. I was terrified because I had no idea who the heck this kid was, and I still have no idea why I couldn't hear him. I cried staring at this kid until I exhausted myself and went to sleep. I couldn't get out of bed, I was too afraid he would come for me. This actually happened several nights in a row, and it always ended in me crying myself to sleep and hiding under my blanket. I finally came to my mom and told her what I was seeing and how scary it really was to me, and she told me to just ask him what he wants or tell him I don't know how to help him. I was a little terrified to try this, but when I woke up that night to go to the bathroom, he was there as usual, and it was the same silent scream and terrifying face on this kid. I gathered my nerves and yelled at him, "I don't know what you want. Please go away, you are scaring me." He closed his mouth. He watched me for a little while, still sitting on my sink. I also just sat there and watched him until I couldn't stay awake anymore. I finally fell asleep. I woke up the next morning feeling much better. I never saw that kid again, and we never did look into why he might have been there. I grew up in southern Colorado. There was an abundance of folklore, including stories about skinwalkers and UFOs. On a summer day when I was around 4 or 5, all of the neighborhood kids were playing near a hay field. Someone threw a ball into the field, and I ran in to retrieve it. The sun had just set, and I could still see where I was going. All of a sudden, I came within 5 feet of a figure, crouched in the grass. It was down on its haunches. I stopped, and we just looked at each other. All I can describe it as was it looked like a werewolf. Part man, part dog. It began to growl. The growl was low, throaty, and deep. And then it stood up. I can tell you that, of course, I was a kid and pretty small, but this creature stood at least 7 feet tall. And when it stood and looked down at me with its very human eyes, it growled again with its mouth open. I wet myself. Stood there and peed in fear. I turned around and ran as fast as I could. I tried to tell my 2 older brothers, but of course got in trouble for peeing my pants instead. When I took my husband to my old hometown, I showed him the spot. He was amazed that I remembered so much in detail. I'll never forget it. It's been 51 years, and the memory is still as vivid. Boy in Grandma's house. In 1940, my grandmother inhabited a modest house. Her back bedroom had an odd vibe, especially in and around the closet. I was visiting with my 2 children, son age 8 and daughter age 3. We had spent a long day at the beach, having a blast. While getting the kids bathed and ready for bed, my son kept picking at his sister. Being that I was worn out and kind of aggravated, I tucked him and my daughter into bed a bit earlier than usual. My son kept coming out of the bedroom to tell me things. They were silly things like needing water or his sister was bothering him. You know, kid stuff. Anyway, I tucked him in one last time and was standing in the kitchen doorway talking with my grandma while she put on a pot of coffee for us. The kids' bedroom was to my left down a narrow hallway. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing in the hall. Thinking it was my son again, I turned to tell him to get back in bed, but I stopped short. Leaning against the hallway wall was a teenaged boy with his arms folded in front of his chest. He had on a short-sleeved striped shirt and brown corduroy pants. He was also wearing suede desert boots, like the kind from the 1970s. He had short, dark brown, curly hair. Both my children were blondes. He was grinning at me, as if he found the situation amusing. He was completely solid, not ghost-like at all. With my mouth open, amazed at what I was looking at, I turned my head to tell my grandmother what I was seeing, but when I looked back towards the hallway, he was gone. The family had always felt there was something in the house. Now I saw who or what it was. The realization that it was a child frightened me, as it is believed that demons sometimes manifest as children. Whatever stayed in the back bedroom near the closet always felt evil and frightening. I never saw anything again, though. Strange shadow creature? So I was sitting outside, it's dark and rainy. I'm standing in a gazebo in my backyard talking to my partner on the phone, and I start to feel really uneasy, so I look up. I'm about 30 to 40 feet away from the roof, mind you, but I see this 3 to 4 foot tall bird silhouette standing on my roof. It's too dark for me to make out features, but it appears to be watching me because its head is turned. I can make out the shape of its beak looking like a curved hook beak. The shape of its head and the shape of its body were strikingly similar. It had the type of broad shoulders that an eagle does, but I don't live in an area with bald eagles, so it couldn't have been that, and every part of my brain told me to get away. I felt so uneasy in that moment, and it only grew so much so that I moved inside my house. My first thought was the Jersey Devil, being that I live in NJ, but it's usually associated with bat-like wings, so I ruled it out. What did I see? A werewolf? When I was about 6, my parents divorced. On this occasion, I was staying at my dad's, and I was 8 years old around 2004. It was in the middle of the night, and a very cold night in Australia, so I was rugged up in bed. Anyway, I woke up after hearing the back door open. I knew my dad was asleep because I could hear him snoring in the next room. I started to panic, and I heard my door open, so I hid under the covers. Then I felt this heavy presence sitting on top of me, and I heard panting like a dog, and I could smell wet dog, which to this day still makes me gag. I remember closing my eyes and trying to stay calm and just thinking to myself, go away, leave. Then I felt the presence disappear, and I heard whatever it was run out the door and slam it behind them. I slowly got up and noticed mud and what looked like dog or animal fur, I don't really know. It was dark, and it felt like horsehair but not as long, and it was on my covers as well as through the house, along with a wet dog smell. I then felt safer, but my adrenaline was still flowing, so I got up, locked all the doors, and checked my dad, who was fine, by the way. I mentioned it the next day, and my dad said it was probably just a stray cat that was roaming the neighborhood and managed to get in somehow, which has happened to my neighbors but only because they don't lock their cat door. Anyway, we don't have a cat door, so that explanation made no sense to me, but I just left it as our relationship was strained enough at that point. My mum just got engaged at the time and later married my stepdad, who is a really good man, and they are still happy, and my dad still manages to take out his anger on me, and I'm now 22. Does anyone have any idea what it could have been? I've done some really basic research, but nothing really came of it. Black Stick Man Phenomenon, Encounter, Scotland, UK. I have always denied anything supernatural, but this experience changed my view on the world. My family and friends don't believe me, so I thought I'd post my story here with all you open-minded folk. Here's a brief overview of the area where it occurred. I live just off the Isle of Skye in Scotland. In the village where I live, there are 2 bridges linking the mainland to Skye. It has a lighthouse and 2 cottages on a wee island between them going back hundreds of years. There's a lot of folklore around the lighthouse. Everyone who has worked there over the centuries has always said the same story, which is that they heard loud voices calling outside the buildings and a massive change in atmosphere. But none of the workers who stayed there, from countries all over the world, could ever identify/understand what the language was. Nor did they see who or what was calling out. Regardless, I don't know if my experience is linked to this, but it happened in the exact same area, which makes my story all the more creepy, in my opinion. The encounter. One night, I was running the Skye Bridge after work at around 9 p.m. I stopped to rest on the first bridge between the cottages and the mainland. The bridges were in complete darkness, and I was using my torch to see where I was going. I leaned on the barrier to catch my breath, looking out over the moonlit loch. When I turned my head and looked back into the streetlights about 100 meters or so away, I was immediately stunned. The hairs stood up all over me, my nerves were shot to pieces, and I was overwhelmed with shock. I watched what seemed to be a 20-foot giant blurry stick figure cross the road. It had no features other than see-through shades of blue and black. Its legs and arms were the same long, thin shape of its body, as was its tall, featureless head. The edges of its legs, arms, and head were strangely squared off. The scariest part of the encounter was the way it crossed the road from right to left in the streetlight. It took long, smooth, slow strides and didn't seem to contact the ground. It glided with its steps. When it reached the other side of the stone wall, it vanished. Then, it instantly reappeared in the same spot and proceeded to cross the road again. It did this over and over and over until it never reappeared. It was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. It's hard to explain it, but it scared me. Since that day, I'm very nervous about going through there. It's always in the back of my mind. If anyone on here has had a similar experience, please contact me. I never shared it because I just thought everyone would think I was nuts. I didn't even know this was a known phenomenon until I started researching it, and my findings creeped me out further due to how similar other people's encounters have been. Tree figure. Okay, so this happened today, and I have no clue what I saw. I was riding a train through the rural Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. As we came around a curve, out in the middle, I saw what I first thought was just a tree that had been burned. The tree was roughly 100 yards, 91.5 meters, away from the train. But the more I looked at it, the more I noticed there were no branches and no top of a tree. And there was nothing around it that looked burned either. It was probably 20 feet, 7 meters, tall. And then I saw at the top what looked to be a skull, and it was staring at the train. It also looked like it might have had a hood covering the rear section of the skull. I thought it might just be a bird sitting on the tree, but whatever it was, I kept turning to look at the train because I never saw another side of it. I tried to do a little research to see if I could figure out what it was, but no luck. Anyone here might know what I saw? Saw a white wolf disappear. Around 2004-ish, my cousin and I were outside late at night. I couldn't pinpoint the exact time, but it was past midnight. We were lying on her mom's car, on the trunk, just staring at the stars when we noticed one star was moving. You had to focus on it to notice it, but it just kept zipping from one spot to the other, back and forth. The spots were very close together, so you had to watch carefully to see it. That weirded us out, and we got the creepiest feelings and decided to go inside. When we stood up from the car, we both saw a white wolf just casually strolling down the road. We lived in the country and knew everyone around us. We knew which kid belonged to who and which dog belonged to which house. It was all family living around us. Like 20 plus houses of nothing but family in that area. Nobody had a dog that looked like that. One person had a Great Pyrenees, but that was the only large white dog in the area, and what we saw was not a farm dog at all. It was very obviously a wolf. After living there for many years, neither of us ever saw a wolf, and we were constantly in those woods. Plenty of coyotes but no wolves. Well, after we saw the wolf, we just stood and stared in silence. It walked about 20 or so yards before it completely disappeared. It was in front of a row of bushes/hedges and was clearly visible as it was white and the hedges looked black at that time of night. But it just disappeared. No noises or fog or anything, it was just there 1 second and gone the next. My cousin and I just looked at each other dumbfounded. We looked around the area, half-assed because we were so creeped out, but we couldn't find an explanation. There was nowhere for it to have gone. Has anyone else experienced anything similar? If so, I'd love to hear your experience. Also, if anyone knows what in the world we experienced that night or has any theories, I'd love to hear them. Can you please help me figure out what tried to kill me and my friends? So, a couple of months ago I was at my friend's house with my friend, Obvi, and my ex. For context, my friend lives next to some woods on the reservation in Montana. He's had several supernatural encounters in these woods, and that night, I did too. All three of us were outside helping my friend do chores. He had to go into the woods to help his neighbors out while my ex and I stayed at the edge of the forest. While we were waiting for my friend to come back, my ex said, "Listen to the coyotes." I calmed down and listened to them, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like coyotes. The sound became more like a whistle. It sounded animalistic and humanoid but at the same time not. It sounded like a whistle that held one note for a really long time and slowly changed notes, going up and down. I've been racking my brain over what this thing could be, but I have no idea. I think it could be a Wendigo or skinwalker, but I'm not sure. Could I please get some help on what this thing is? Demonic faces in the dark. This is actually my first time ever sharing anything on here, so forgive me if I make any dumb mistakes. The main reason I wanted to post this is to get people's opinions about this. As far back as I can remember, up until I was 15 years old, I am currently 31 years old, every time I would close my eyes at night in my house, in the darkness of my closed eyes, I would immediately start seeing demonic/scary looking faces coming at me. What I mean by that is the faces would manifest from the darkness and zoom past me and through me. And I want to be clear, this is when I was still wide awake. It would happen as soon as I closed my eyes and stop as soon as I opened them. It happened so often that it was my normal, and I actually thought it was normal and thought nothing of it other than that it was annoying. A lot of other creepy stuff happened in that house, poltergeist type stuff, but this post is not about that. It pretty much stopped after we moved out of that house. The weird thing is that recently, my brother and I were talking about living in that house, and I came to find out that he used to see those faces too. There was one face in particular that I recognized that he described. It is the face of some demonic looking pissed off old lady that always would appear looking away and then turn around, open her mouth like in a scream, and go towards me/claw at my face. I was extremely shocked when he told me that he used to see this same thing. I never messed around with the occult, but I know my grandma dated a Satanist at one point. My mom has a lot of super crazy stories about inexplicable gusts of wind entering the house along with ear-piercing metallic grinding noises. And I also know that my mom told me she found a voodoo-type doll in my beloved grandma's purse one time. My main question is, what was that? Was that a demonic entity that was simply ducking with me? I live in a house with 4 roommates, all men. I think of them as brothers, and we never really worry about anything like intruders, etc., and we always have our 3 back doors unlocked. Now to give you some visual aids, I live in the front part of the house, the living area, and 2 of the doors are the back doors to my roommates' rooms. The back doors lead out to a porch that overlooks our backyard. The backyard is large, though it's a pretty urban area. It snowed a few days ago, and there's still some snow on the ground, and it's freezing, but no smoking in the house. I pull on my jacket and throw on some slippers. I grumble to my roommates about having to go outside to smoke alone but trudge out our back doors anyway. Usually I bring my phone, or another person, but this time I didn't. I've been bringing people because I've been hearing strange noises. I'm not the only one either. My other roommates have heard them as well. Sounds that resonate in our backyard but seem to have no place. They sort of sounded like chimes. The fence surrounding our yard is wood until about halfway up, and then the chain links start. So it's about 12:30 a.m., and I'm on the porch smoking when something catches my eye. Now, I have 2 cats in my house, my boy cat and my roommate's female cat. There's a cat that wanders around and tries to sneak in from time to time, and I noticed that this thing that caught my eye is close to the ground and wiggling. I assume it's the cat, and I look around for something to shoo the cat away. Finding nothing, I resort to building a snowball and I throw it. A small one, nothing too big, I don't want to hurt it, I just want it to go on. So I throw the snowball, and it hits it. It was then that I realized how big this thing was. As soon as the ball hit it, my entire body filled with an outstanding fear. One that I cannot explain. I was frozen. I watched it like this. The thing slowly rose from its crouched position. It looked like a man, but gross, its knees bent the wrong way, and it had gross, sagging skin. It was unbelievably tall, its arms were twice as long as a person's, its face was distorted, crinkled with the same wrinkles that creased its body. It looked at me. And I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. With inhuman speed, it took off towards the back of my yard, and it was gone. My feet started moving again, and with a cigarette still in hand, I crashed through the doors into my house. I screamed at my roommates to lock the doors and tried to calm my trembling. I can't get the image of this thing out of my mind. I can't calm myself. They keep telling me I'm tripping and that it can't be real. But it's Christmas, I'm not on any drugs, and I know what I saw. I didn't want this. I'm terrified. What do I do? What did I see? The little boy. I grew up in a rural area that at one time bore witness to an atrocity, carried out by native tribesmen on the European settlers living there. I am not sure if this has anything to do with what I'm about to tell you. When I was a child of maybe 6 or 7 years, my bed was situated against a bank of windows. I would lie looking out into the night until I fell asleep. One very moonlit evening as I lay there, I distinctly remember seeing the shadow of a boy run across our yard. This was extremely odd given that our house sat atop a small hill approximately 150 feet from the road. Being a child, I wanted to run outside after him, but he moved so quickly that he was gone before I stood up from my bed. As the years went on, I thought about this many times and wondered if it was just my youthful imagination. Fast forward, now I am 16 and had started sneaking cigarettes from my mother's pack and was out sitting on some concrete steps, enjoying one of my ill-gotten smokes, and keeping a close eye and ear on being caught smoking by my parents. That's when it happened again. I'll be damned if that shadow didn't run past again quickly and silently not 10 feet from where I sat. Mind you, there was no physical body to have cast this shadow, no sound of feet falling on the lawn, just the unmistakable silhouette of a child running as fast as he could across our lawn toward a thick section of woods that ran along the northern line of our property. I was blown away, to say the least, but I didn't mention this to anyone for several days, until one night I brought it up to my older sister, who, by the way, seemed to be an antenna for supernatural events, who at once lost all color in her face, abandoning all cheerful expression. She looked at me blankly and said, "You see him too." Apparently, this little apparition appeared as a solid, living boy of about 9 or 10, wearing overalls, with a well-worn newsboy-style hat upon his head. He beckoned to the girls to follow him into the woods. Only females saw him in this form, and as far as I know, I am the only one to see him as a shadow running. After I explained to my sister what it was that I saw, not a full figure of a child but merely the shadow cast by an unseen body, she informed me that our oldest sister saw him too, and several of their friends, my mother, and 3 of my aunts. I asked my cousin about this years later, and before I could finish the question, she described the boy in the overalls and hat just as my sister had years before. And if that isn't creepy enough, a couple of years back I was hired to do an electrical installation at the new home of the daughter of one of the girls who used to frequently visit our farm. This girl had stayed in touch with my mother and continued visiting her even after my sister married and moved away. One morning as I prepared myself for work, she approached me. She asked if I was aware that she often visited my parents' home with her mother when she was a girl. I said I did remember her being there with her mother, and then out of nowhere she said, "Did you ever see a little boy in overalls and an old hat over by the woods?" This gave me quite a shock, as no one had mentioned it in many years. I guess he is still there, though all of us have gone, running through the deep night, from some danger long ago, and trying to entice the girls to follow him into that small patch of woods. Is it paranormal or inhumane? For some background, where I live is a small street on the backbones of an old golf course that's surrounded by some wilderness and a creek with not very well-known trails. I used to walk the trail with my dogs but stopped through the summer due to an influx of less than friendly homeless people taking it over and camping there. They were eventually all removed and taken into custody after someone went to walk the trail sometime in October and found these people cooking their own substances. Last night, December 5th, I went to enjoy the trail again with my dogs like I used to and let them play in the snow. Almost halfway through our walk, I grabbed the dogs and fled from the thicket of trees. It was then that I noticed more than a dozen rodents, rats, squirrels, mice, etc., hanging from the tree branches by their feet, their heads completely missing. I don't know if this was some sick trick someone set up for unknowing passers-by like myself or if it's coming from a cult. I've had speculations form in my town since this isn't the first time I've noticed such things, especially around the golf course. 2 weird/possibly connected stories about deer. The first story happened about a year ago. I live in the middle of nowhere with woods surrounding me on all sides. The only thing separating the woods is my yard and a road. I went to take the garbage down to the road, and that's when I noticed it. I saw a deer that was lying down. From its torso to the tip of its antlers was around 11 feet tall. Its entire body was proportional, just several times bigger. It looked at me, its eyes seemed to be glowing red, and the fur on half its face was peeled off. It stared at me, and a few seconds after I looked at it, its eyes went dull, they went black. I didn't feel fear at the moment, I felt calm but confused. It lay still other than its head, which followed my every movement. The second story happened a few months ago. I was taking my girlfriend home, and I was on my way back, about 2 miles from my house, when I saw a doe. Her body faced the road and me perfectly head on. She snapped her head in my direction and stared right at me. Then slowly it sat down, like a dog, sitting on her hind legs as her front legs were perfectly straight. She stared right at me as I drove down the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see she was still staring at me. What could this thing or things be? 2010, Sweden. It was me and 2 friends back in 2010, and we were in our late teens. It was the middle of the night, and we had been doing something I can't remember, but we were sober. We walked home, and naturally, the friend who lived closest turned off first. About 10 minutes later, we got a call from him asking us to come to his house. He had heard some noises and thought someone might be in the house. When we arrived, he was standing on the road outside, waiting for us. To give some context, this guy didn't believe in anything supernatural at the time, so he was pretty sure it was an actual person in the house. We started searching the entire house, closets, under beds, everywhere, but found nothing. We were a bit spooked but concluded that there was no one in the house. So, we decided to make the best of it and play a horror game. We sat down in a room upstairs, they lay down on the bed, and I sat down at the computer, which was right next to the door. Before I even started the game, I heard someone tiptoeing outside the door. I jumped up to open it but hesitated at the last second with my hand on the handle. As I stood there, hesitating, someone on the outside pulled the handle, causing my hand to move up and down several times. I reacted by grabbing the handle with both hands and pushing it up as hard as I could, holding the door shut. I told my friends to get up, and on the count of 3, we ran out. We ran downstairs, grabbed something to defend ourselves with, and searched the whole house again. Still, we found nothing. We kept searching for maybe 30 minutes, but as the sun began to rise, we gave up and lay down on the couch to watch a movie instead. The sun shone through the upstairs window, and from the couch, we could see the wall via the staircase. As we were lying there, I saw the shadow of a figure, what I would call a man, walking back and forth upstairs. But at that moment, I realized there was no point. There was nowhere for anyone to hide up there and no way for anyone to get there from outside. So, I didn't say anything to my friends, and we continued watching the movie. Red eyes. I am looking for some answers about an event that happened when I was 7, I'm now in my 40s. My grandfather died when I was 5, but I saw a ghost of him, or whatever entity assumed his form, when I spent the night at my grandmother's house. I saw him standing down the hall from the bed I was sleeping in. He was wearing a suit. However, most prominently, he had these glowing red eyes. They were penetrating in the most prominent part of the whole image. I did not have paralysis and ended up sleeping under the covers the rest of the night. There were no feelings of dread. It was only the weirdness of the event that was frightening. I did not feel threatened. Does anybody have any input on the red eyes? Is there a symbolism to this or an indication of what kind of entity it was? I'd like to think that it was my grandfather, but the red eye part makes me think differently. It had quite an effect on me because it changed how I viewed reality, and of course, nobody believed the story, so I had to try to process this on my own as a young child. My life might have been easier had it never happened. Australia, up where I live in Cairns, there's a lot of local Aboriginal legends, and people take them pretty seriously. One of them is about a woman spirit who lures people into the dangerous currents at Devil's Pool, where 20 people have drowned since the 60s. My good friend claims she can sense spirits, and whether or not you believe in it, she is fully convinced, just know that she does not like having this ability. Anyway, she had a terrible experience at this particular spot. She, along with her boyfriend and my ex-boyfriend, foolishly went swimming there. They all got weird vibes and realized it was way deeper and the current quite stronger than it looked. So they left quickly around sunset. My friend says that she and her BF were followed home by the spirit, and it messed around with them that night, moving stuff and making noise, until they both fled their house screaming. Like 2 people have drowned there in the last year alone. Another nearby spot is the Goldsboro Valley Campgrounds, which I know a few locals avoid for bad vibes. It used to be a major meeting spot for the Aboriginal tribes, but once gold was discovered in the valley, the newly arrived men mistreated the Aboriginals. I camped there years ago and had a distressing incident in the toilets where I heard loud, strange noises and shuffling, but there was no person or animal around. The experience left me feeling uneasy, prompting me to inform my coworker about it a few days later. My coworker, who is First Nations, expressed her concern by saying, "Ooh, girl, don't camp there again." A few years later, several coworkers were camping there when they noticed strange lights in the trees and heard yelling all around them one night. They left first thing in the morning. I think something is hunting my fiancé. So, I came here because we are absolutely clueless as to what the thing following my fiancé is. I was hoping someone with a little more knowledge than me could help me shed some light on this. It's unclear whether this phenomenon is supernatural or not. My fiancé first encountered this thing in 2013. He and his friends were on a camping trip up in the woods in Maine, literally in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses in sight for miles. They had a small fire going, but due to the rain, it was hard to keep it going. They kept hearing something trying to creep up on them. It was noisy and sounded large, yet it was only 2 feet tall. They started throwing rocks in the direction they heard the footsteps, and suddenly this thing let out a blood-curdling scream, nothing any of them had heard before. He describes it as something that sounds like a fox but slightly more human. It went crashing through the woods super clumsily, but it kept trying to come back. They had to fend it off most of the night. The second time was about a year and a half later. He was out on a solo camping trip in Vermont since that was something he enjoyed. He heard the same exact blood-curdling scream he had heard the first time. He was just sitting alone in the dark, looking at the stars with no fire or anything when suddenly he heard the scream again. He quickly packed everything up and just went home with no hesitation. The third time was tonight. He was supposed to go out to my car to grab us a couple bottles of water when he heard voices. Due to us recently having someone come onto our property and stealing from our landlords, he went to investigate. He calls me and tells me to let the dog out. As he was sneaking around, the voices turned to a snarling sound. He quickly stopped, turned off his flashlight, and dropped to the ground. The dog was standing next to him. Suddenly he sees 2 glowing eyes, and it lunges at him. The dog gets excited and starts chasing it. The whole time they're chasing it, it's screaming and running faster than our dog. Even though he was running with a flashlight, he couldn't make out the shape of its body. He says how far apart the eyes were made it seem kind of big. He couldn't get a shape or color besides where its body should be, which was a slight discoloration of the darkness around it. It kept looking back at him while he chased it, and its eyes were just glowing while it screamed. Our dog chased it off into the woods, but luckily she came back. I think it was trying to lure him in by making it sound like voices, but the dog scared it. He said he couldn't get a height because the eye level kept changing from squatting to standing up, and then it started running. Has anyone experienced anything like this? Does anyone know the identity of this animal or supernatural entity? I think I saw a demon the other night. The creature had the head of a goat and the body of a gorilla. The incident occurred on November 25th at 4 a.m. I woke up in a panic. I have been having sleep paralysis this whole month. It happens every November and whenever I am stressed. This time was different, though. I woke up and was able to pull out of my sleep paralysis fairly quickly. But I felt this intense feeling of something staring at me with deep hatred. I sat up fast and looked around my room, something I never do. Usually after a sleep paralysis episode, I dig deeper into my covers because it's frightening. But this time, I felt scared and in danger. At the doorway of my room was this 8 to 10 foot tall thing. It had a goat head, I don't remember seeing horns on it, and a gorilla body. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on and shined it. I didn't feel brave enough to shine it at its face, but I illuminated it enough to see its body and a bit of its face. I saw enough and screamed. A long scream. To be honest, I purposely screamed for a long time so my dad could come save me lol. Embarrassingly enough. Luckily, my parents live with me, and my dad did end up barging into my room. He stayed at the doorway for a second, scanning my room, then ran in. When he ran in, he went through the demon-looking thing. It grimaced when my dad walked through it and it dispersed. My dad ended up hugging me for a bit before we had a sleepover in the living room with the cats. I know I'm 30, female, too damn old to have my dad hugging me to sleep, but that thing looked frightening. My dad is nearing 60 and is very into Catholicism, to almost an extreme, as he grew up seeing what his grandmother had to go through as a curandera, a village healer. He says he sees a lot of ghosts and demons. He always has his prayer music on. He wasn't always like this. He always said he could see the supernatural but wasn't religious before. He got into a really stressful situation a few years ago, and all of this magnified to where it is now. And to be honest, I thought this was religious psychosis. I'm not religious at all, as the Catholic Church traumatized me growing up. And honestly, I was really hoping all these ghosts/shadows/demons I was seeing were just an overactive REM cycle or just my mind filling in the blanks, but this goat head, gorilla body thing looked so real, and it freaked me out when the flashlight didn't make it go away. Any thoughts on this? I've never had anything supernatural before and don't really believe in any of that. I lived in my van for a few years and sometimes would feel nervous or scared something could happen or that maybe the people camping nearby could actually be bad people. But this last Saturday night I was terrified and paralyzed with fear I've never felt before. My friend and I went camping down in the Swell, Utah. We saw no cars on our way to our campsite, which was near the mouth of Black Dragon Wash Canyon. Later in the night, around 1 a.m., we'd been laughing and making jokes inside the tent. We had already zipped it up, and my dog snapped to attention and began growling in a specific direction. My friend and I paused and started to listen and began to hear movement. It then began to sound like footsteps, and then I heard the distinct sound of a zipper. It wasn't our tent but something outside of it. Everything in my body froze and began to scream that something bad was close. Everything went silent. But then we'd hear it again, slow, deliberate steps. I called my boyfriend, who was at home. As soon as he answered, I hung up and texted him that someone was outside our tent and we needed help. I've been in sketchy situations where I've had to physically fend people off, so I know I have a fight response in me. But I felt so insanely weak. All I could do was tremble while my dog growled, looking in different directions. It sounded like two people were circling the tent. My boyfriend and 911, whom I was texting, kept asking if it was animals, and I swear it wasn't. It sounded like clothes rustling. It sounded like slow footsteps, not the scurrying of raccoons or the gait of animals. And it was so quiet outside of those movements. Sometimes it would go quiet, but then it felt active again. At one point it felt like several people were circling around us. We had a light inside that was already lit, so it felt like every move we made was being watched. We were terrified of doing anything that could be interpreted as the first move, so I didn't look up but swear I saw a shifting silhouette. Minutes before the sheriff arrived, I swear I saw something press against the tent from the outside that looked like a hand touching the tent and dragging itself along it. We weren't near any trees, and it was a distinct shape/shadow, not just a tarp bending in from the wind. When the sheriff arrived, he kept thinking it was a deer. But we had been so loud, I don't know what timid animal would approach. Even if it was people friendly, I distinctly heard a zipper sound and saw what looked like a hand against our tent. I felt crazy and ridiculous, but every time I think back on it, I'm so thankful I was quick to call my boyfriend and 911. I don't know the word for what I felt because terrified isn't close to strong enough. I had this crushing feeling that I was going to be murdered violently. I was writing what I thought were my last words to my boyfriend, telling him he was the best thing to have ever happened and to have kids no matter what and deserved love and happiness because I didn't want my death getting in the way of him having the family he always dreamed of. I feel crazy, but I can't deny how my body feels. And it feels like I would have died if I hadn't gotten out of there. I guess I'm just sharing this here because I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. Strange figure in front of my bed. This morning at around 5 to 6, I woke up because I heard what sounded like feet shuffling on my carpet, and I thought it was my cat, but when I opened my eyes, I could vaguely see a figure that moved hella unnaturally. Like, its arms were kinda dangling at its sides, and it had a bounciness in its step. And it walked in front of me and then leaned to the side and tilted its head sideways like it was observing me. I was a little scared, but my room was really dark, so I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. So I closed my eyes and told myself I'm fine and don't open them, but I did, and the figure was still there. I quickly closed them again, and this time I did not open them, but then I kind of felt a weight on my mattress like it was getting on my bed to get a closer look at me. I freaked out and pulled my blanket over my face. Then I felt the weight leave my bed, but I still didn't remove my blanket. Eventually I heard my mom leave her room to use the toilet, and I finally got brave enough to look back at the figure, but by then it was gone. I know for a fact that it wasn't a dream, because I could feel my heart beating, and my mind was conscious and aware of its surroundings. I would not have been alarmed by this at all if it weren't for the fact that I could actually hear feet moving across my carpet. And I could feel some sort of weight on my bed. Like, my eyes trick me all the time, but never my ears and never my sense of weight. I couldn't see much of the figure, but I could tell that it had long arms, grayish skin, and large, black eyes. It had a really tiny mouth that hung open, almost as if it was dumbfounded by what it was seeing. Like it's never seen a person before or something. I don't directly believe in the supernatural, but I do believe that there's a lot about our world that we as humans don't know. And who knows, somewhere in that vast expanse of abstract ideas that we're not yet aware of, there could be an explanation of what I saw. And heard. And felt. God, I wish I hadn't heard or felt anything. Then I could have just passed this off as my eyes and brain making things up. My encounter with the supernatural. This story occurred roughly 2 years ago in January. If I remember correctly, it was sometime during Michigan's rabbit season. My dad, grandpa, little brother, and I were participating in an event called the Rabbit Rodeo, in which you go and hunt small game, and whoever has the most, within legal limits, wins. We had already spent most of the day hunting, and we had had no luck. So we went to a different part of the woods that was bordered by a swamp on 2 sides and cornfields on the other 2. There was a hill facing the northeasternmost corner, which is where I sat. In that spot, you have very thick swamp in front of you and to your right. To your back and left is a forest that eventually ends in farm fields. There was a tree that had been uprooted in a storm a few months prior, and I sat in the hole waiting for some small critter to come by that I could shoot with my 12 gauge. After about an hour of sitting there, I heard a loud commotion coming from behind me. After I got up and walked for a few hundred yards, I saw a very tall dead tree with hundreds, if not thousands, of crows circling it in a clockwise direction. This went on for the few minutes I stood there. When I stepped forward, they all scattered in every direction. Not thinking too much of it, I went back to my hole in the ground. By this time, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over dead leaves on the ground. I waited for another few minutes when I heard someone call my name. Except it came from the swamp directly in front of me. Keep in mind that the other members of my party were all at least half a mile south of where I'm at. The voice didn't sound like any of them either. It was a man's voice, but not high-pitched like my little brother's, nor was it gruff like my dad and grandpa's voice. It was more like a young man in his 20s or 30s, soft, but still masculine. At first I thought that I was just hearing things, but then I heard it again, but from behind a tree 30 yards from me, telling me to come closer. I did not. I gripped my weapon in case anyone or anything came at me. Nothing happened, and my dad arrived to pick me up half an hour later. I never told him. I've only told this story to a few people. When asking them what they think it was, I've heard a variety of answers. Some say it was a homeless man or a tweaker. Others say it was a ghost or a demon. And others say it was a Wendigo. I don't know what it was. Now I carry a rosary with me wherever I go. What do you all think of this? I was 14 at the time, and this took place in southwestern Michigan. We never got any rabbits, by the way. A real supernatural incident that I experienced when I was 10 years old. I am from Asia and have a deep fascination for the supernatural. I have been listening ghost stories shared in this community for quite some time now and have enjoyed a lot of them. However, today I would like to share an incident that happened with me when I was 10 years old. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any grammatical errors in advance. So here is what happened. This incident took place when I was 10, the year was 2001, and I was living with my maternal uncle and his wife, as my school at that time was just 5 minutes away from their home. My uncle's wife had given birth to their second child, and another one of my aunts had decided to stay with us to help my uncle and aunt manage things. We used to sleep in the same room, as there were 3 beds in the room arranged in a U shape. My aunt and her newborn child used to sleep in one bed, my other aunt and the first child used to sleep on the second bed, and I and my uncle used to sleep on the third one. One night, my uncle woke me up, and he looked pretty excited. I was still half asleep and didn't understand what was happening. He said I needed to get up quickly as someone was here to meet me. I thought it was already morning and my parents had come to see me, and I got excited and sat up pretty quickly, and what I saw completely puzzled me. Both my aunts were sitting together on the bed opposite mine, and my uncle also went there and sat beside my aunts as soon as I got up, and there was a girl standing in front of them. She looked like she was 16 to 17 years old, and she was smiling at me. She started walking towards me. This scared me, and I jumped and stood over my bed. She tried to climb over the bed, but I pushed her, and she fell down. She got up, looked at me, and started trying to get on the bed again, and I pushed her back again. This happened a third time too, and I got really scared. The fact that my uncles and aunts were watching all this quietly freaked me out. When she got up the fourth time, I closed my eyes, joined my hands in prayer, and started praying out loudly. After a few moments of praying, I felt someone's hand on my shoulder, and for a moment I thought that girl caught me, but when I opened my eyes, it was my uncle. He asked me why I was standing on my bed and praying out so loudly in the middle of the night. They assumed that I was sleep talking, but I explained to them that I was not and told them about the whole incident. They comforted me and tried to make me go back to sleep, but the fear of what had just happened prevented me from going to sleep again that night. At that time they convinced me it was just a bad dream, but when we talk about that incident now, they admit that they all believe in the supernatural and that what I saw that night could be 100% real. I know there is a little scientific proof that spirits exist, but I truly believe that I was not dreaming that day and whatever I saw was real. I'm still having a hard time processing what I saw a few nights ago. About 3 nights ago. I saw something that I still can't fully understand or explain. First, a little background. I live in mid-Michigan in a small residential/suburban town surrounded by cornfields, you know the type. However, I do live in the more populated area, as my parents' house, where I currently reside, is located within walking distance of our downtown. Our street is by no means desolate, dark, or isolated, and most of the houses are fairly close to one another. A pretty urban setting given the town itself. Okay, back to the other night. It was about 2:30 a.m., and since it's pretty normal for me to be up that late, my dog and I have developed what I call our little routine. He comes to my door, lets out a huff to inform me that he's there, and then we go downstairs, where I let him outside through the front door to go to the bathroom. After completing his business, he comes in, and we share a midnight snack of ham straight from the fridge lol. Now keep in mind, my dog is extremely well trained and very old. He doesn't need a leash or a fence to keep him from running away, he always comes right back after he's done, he'll even wait at the door if you aren't there. So on this particular night, I open the door for him, and I'm just about to turn and walk away so I can prepare our midnight snack when I notice he's still standing on the porch staring across the street. This isn't completely out of the norm for him, but this was lasting a bit longer than usual. When he finally jumps off the porch, I follow his line of sight where he had been staring, and I see what looks like a large dog or maybe even a wolf, slinking across my neighbor's yard on the other side of the street. For the first few seconds I'm trying to figure out WTF this thing is, because it looks like it could be a dog, but something isn't right. It's too long, and the way it's moving isn't normal. And even though it was only about 50 feet away, it looked as though it were blurry. I can't think of any other way to describe it. None of it made sense. At this point I go into panic mode because so far this creature hasn't seemed to notice me or my dog, but if it does, my dog doesn't stand a chance. Like I said, he's old. Besides, he is a Pomeranian. Whatever this thing was, it would destroy him, no doubt. I decide to slowly open the outer glass door, hoping to create just enough noise to alert my dog that it's time to come in, but not enough for whatever that thing is to hear me too. Luckily, my dog notices right away and starts running back towards me. But at the same time, this dog creature starts turning toward me, slowly. It almost felt fake how unnatural it moved, like animatronics or something. I'm not even sure what I'm looking at, but I have this indescribable feeling that I'm not supposed to be seeing this. So, as this thing is turning to look at me, my dog is coming through the door simultaneously, and for about 1 second, I take my eyes off the creature thing to look down at my dog and close the door. When I look back up, this thing has moved about 30 feet to the left into my neighbor's driveway rather than their yard and is standing on its hind legs at around 7 to 8 feet tall, staring at me. Now I'm really freaking out. How did it move so quickly, and how did it not make a single sound? How is it so ducking tall? I literally looked away for maybe a second. I look away again to lock the door and gather myself, only to look again and see absolutely nothing. The entity had vanished. This whole ordeal only lasted maybe 20 to 30 seconds total. Shaking, I give my dog his ham and mine, and I run downstairs to my brother's room in the basement to tell him what happened. Being a normal 19-year-old playing video games, his response was, "Wow, WTF, that's super weird." But honestly, I just needed to tell someone, to confirm that what just happened actually happened and that I wouldn't wake up the next day and convince myself it was a dream. Over the last few days, I've told anyone who would listen about what I saw, including my parents. Those who are closer to me seemed a bit more unnerved, because, like I mentioned earlier, I don't usually believe in this type of thing. They could tell I was shaken by whatever it was that I saw. Tonight, after some random search as the result of my restless mind, I came across what appears to be the exact description of what I saw. The dog man, which eventually led me here. I've never heard anything about it before, but I am now fully convinced I saw one in front of my very own eyes, and it saw me too. Maynok. In a small village along the banks of the Pra-Kanong River, there lived a beautiful woman named Nok. She was deeply in love with her husband, Mok, and their love was the talk of the village. Nock was pregnant with their first child when Mock was conscripted to fight in a distant war. Despite the sorrow of separation, Nock remained hopeful for his safe return. Tragically, during childbirth, both Nock and her baby passed away. The villagers mourned their loss, but life had to go on. When Mock finally returned from the war, he found his home just as he had left it, with Nock and their baby seemingly waiting for him. Overjoyed, he ignored the villagers' warnings that his wife was now a ghost. Mac's blissful ignorance was shattered one evening when he saw Nock stretch her arm unnaturally long to pick up a fallen lime from the floor. Realizing the truth, he fled in terror. Nock, now a vengeful spirit, pursued him relentlessly. Mock sought refuge in a temple, where the sanctity of the grounds protected him from her wrath. The monks at the temple performed rituals to exorcise Nock's spirit. They first confined her to a clay jar, which was thrown into the river. However, her spirit was too powerful and continued to haunt the village. In a second attempt, the monks trapped her spirit in a waistband, which was said to be kept by the royal family of Thailand to this day. Despite the exorcisms, the legend of Mae Nock endures, a poignant tale of love, loss, and the supernatural that continues to captivate and terrify those who hear it. I think I saw Dog Man last night. So I, my friend, and my friend's sister were exploring this abandoned mill near my house last night. As we climbed the first house's stairs to the second floor, we heard something move. My sister was at the top of the steps, and I was somewhere near the middle. I pointed my flashlight around the middle of the room, and we all saw this big, gray, furry creature that looked like it was hunched over. I saw a tail, and my sister said she saw it had big, meaty shoulders, humanoid hands, and glowing yellow eyes. We quickly realized that the creature, whatever it was, would likely not be pleased to find us in its territory, and we swiftly fled the area. What really sent chills down our spine was the fact that when we walked around the house, we noticed that there was a ladder going up to the second story. Because we had to step up on this barrel and climb onto a metal pole to get into the house, which was about 7 or 8 feet off the ground, whatever creature it was probably couldn't have gotten up that way. If it used a ladder, it was definitely something humanoid and ducked up. Once we got back home, we did our research about possible animals it could have been, and living in Virginia, there were not any animals that resembled the creature we saw at all. It was too big to be a fox or a cat, it had different fur than a wolf, it had a tail, so it couldn't be a bear. So we did more research into cryptids. We came across the stories of Dog Man, and when we looked at the pictures that came up, it seemed to resemble what we saw. I read some stories about dogmen, and they said that people that see it usually form obsessions over it, and my sister, being the only one that saw its eyes, was ranting and raving about being so curious as to wanting to go back and see it again the whole way back. My sister drew a sketch of what she saw and was doing some tarot readings after we got home. She had her cards stacked on her sketchbook, and a bug crawled on it and started going crazy, running around until it stepped on the top card on the deck, then it stopped moving. My friend picked up the top card, and it was the Wolfman card of my sister's Native American tarot deck. We're thinking of going back to investigate soon, but I just wanted to tell this story to let you know that there may be dogmen in Virginia. I and my friends experienced something last night, and I can't stop thinking about it. I and my friend, who I'll call Jay, decided to go on a walk around our town, and we ended up going to the outskirts of town. On our walk I started to get a bad feeling in my stomach and felt like I was being watched. I stopped walking and turned around to see if somebody or something was watching me. When I turned around, I saw 3 shadow figures, 2 doing bear crawls towards me and the one in the middle standing straight up, flailing its arms around. I turned to Jay and asked, "Oh my God, dude, do you see that?" Jay looked at me with confusion and said, "See what?" I was terrified, then I noticed they were getting closer. "Jay, I think we should continue walking," he agreed, and so we turned around and started walking. After a minute or two I heard a car coming, so I decided to turn around to see what would happen when the headlights hit the figures. Once the headlights hit, they were gone. After that, my friend and I decided to continue walking down this dark road. While walking, I thought I might as well tell him a dream I had a while back. In this dream I was in my room. For context, my bed is on the other side of the room from my window, and my window has blackout curtains covering them that my cats will, on rare occasions, pull off the wall because they were only held up by 3 thumbtacks. Anyway, in my dream, I wake up to see that my curtain is lying on the ground. In my tired state I decided to get up and hang the curtains back up. When I got up, my floodlights turned on. Outside my window was a pile of dead animals with my 2 cats at the top of the pile, and I freaked out and woke up. When we got to this part while telling my friend, we heard an unnatural dog barking, which stopped us in our tracks. Then, as quickly as the sound appeared, it disappeared. Stupidly, we decided to continue walking, and I went back to telling my dream. When I woke up, my curtains were still down, but my cats were in the room looking at me. So I got up, and the floodlights turned on again, revealing a big black dog sitting on where the pile of dead animals was. I freaked out and ran to my mom's room screaming and tried to shake her awake, saying, "Mom, I think I saw a skinwalker outside." Just as I had said that, our front lights kicked on, and in the wind I saw the dog looking right at me. Then I woke up again in a cold sweat for real this time. At this point, while I'm telling my story, we hear what sounds like an air horn. Then it started wheezing. I almost ducking booked it out of there when my friend told me to walk slowly and silently. Then it was like it never happened. I don't know if all of these are connected, but what do you think? So, basically, I just live by a cemetery. Not just by, I guess, but within its premises. As my parents often told me, there was no boundary for the cemetery before they bought the land and built a house on it. There could be old graves in my kitchen, is all I know. There is a whole row of houses besides ours, and that too in the same lane, which means they are also probably living over graves that were gone at the time all of us bought land here. The thing is, I never felt anything here. Not even a cold feeling or eerie vibe. I can see graves from my window first thing when I wake up or go to bed, or sometimes if I wake up in the middle of the night. I have spent a lot of time alone at home without ever getting scared. We as a neighborhood use the cemetery as a shortcut to go places no matter the time. It could be a hot summer day without anyone around or the blackest of the night, and we won't get scared. The whole place is so silent, it's basically a graveyard, but never in my life did I feel it was something that could possibly be considered scary or eerie. But whenever I tell anyone who doesn't obviously have the same opinion about it, they get super weird about it. All I can hear after telling people that I did come into contact with supernatural phenomena or got scared and so much more. I guess the place is very well domesticated at this point. Kids play there all the time for God's sake. It's basically a pathway for us to go places instead of something scary. But I guess it's just the common perception that cemeteries and abandoned places will ooze horror and eerie vibes, especially at night, and people are very adamant about it. So, if any of you live in a place like me, do you experience something akin to the supernatural? Have you ever felt the presence of some kind? Could be anything really. I just want to know the experience of other people. We lived in a pretty small town in Sweden for 12 years, pretty small compared to Stockholm, OFC, in a big house close to a cemetery, and this place was haunted. It was the first time in my entire life I had seen shadow people in our villa. I never reflected on it until now. And when I saw them, I was fully awake. It was no sleep paralysis, no one died in this house. It was drawn by an architect and his students in the late 80s and early 90s, as far as I recall, and it was a splendid, well-renovated house. Full of light, open spaces, and so on. But near the garage in our wine cellar, it was always strange energy. I am a fearless, sometimes stupid, sometimes blatantly ignorant, highly sensitive person with ADHD, so the spirituality comes with me always picking fights or being a bit dismissive about messing with the supernatural, and I was always drawn to the darkness. So every time I physically encountered those people, I was just saying hi, or really, just observing with a smirk on my face, and then realized that I had seen something supernatural and just shrugged my shoulders. My family members are Christians, so we really had holy water and stuff around the house and got some blessings on it as well, but it did not help. The energy was there. And I think I could have brought it with me from the cemetery where I used to run, disrespectful towards the dead, but I was really into running and training for running long distances as well. Once I also brought some poltergeist with me from a friend, which I got rid of, but it's another story. When I moved out from my parents and moved to Stockholm, I have never seen shadow people again in my life. Of course I got wiser, went into Norse protection spells and spiritual work, and I have seen ghosts in haunted places since then, but never the shadow people. I usually walk through a cemetery on some of my weekend walks, sit there sometimes, and rest, but in my new apartment it's silent. And this little space has seen a lot of trauma and drama as well. Nothing latched. My folks live now in a nearby town. They moved out of the house in town in summer 2019, 500 meters from a cemetery again, also with a crematorium, but this cemetery is peaceful, and their house is good as well. Our cat likes the house too. So it depends, of course, on location or how close you live, but some places are haunted as hell. And it's interesting how it is like that. And why? My nighttime visitor. When I was in high school, we moved into an old sugar plantation house in Hawaii. The 1899 mansion served as the plantation manager's house. I had the entire second floor to myself. My parents had the master bedroom on the main level. At first, I thought how cool for me. Right away, I noticed that this place isn't warm and cozy. Only our small family room seemed comfortable. Everywhere I went, I felt watched, uneasy, and not alone. Even a bright sunny day couldn't warm the place up. If you went to a window with sunshine pouring in, the unease and coolness didn't dissipate. One especially frightening area was a winding service corridor at the end of the upstairs hallway. You would have to walk past 3 empty bedrooms and another bathroom to access this narrow passage. It had a couple of levels and led downstairs to the kitchen. It was only dimly lit, and I would make quick work of this shortcut downstairs, no stopping and no lingering. After some time, I would wake up for no reason at night, and it was always just a few minutes around 3 a.m. Infuriating. It got to the point that I thought I was now causing this, programming my inner clock to wake up at the same time each night. I lay awake listening to the sound of little feet running and bouncing balls in the attic room above me. Turns out that attic was a plantation schoolhouse in the early 1900s. A one-time peek upstairs, and sure enough, the furnishings, chalkboard, and assorted toys still were scattered throughout. I wondered why, after so many years, previous occupants would just leave it all. I honestly kept telling myself that perhaps rodents infested the space and were running amok at 3 a.m. Finally, a last straw. I have a vivid dream of being pulled up into the sky. So high I resist, I don't want this to continue. Suddenly I'm falling back toward Earth and wake up with a start. A glance at the clock, and yes, it is 3 a.m. once again. Suddenly my ears feel the air pressure change in the room. My eardrums shudder, and now it becomes so cold and frigid in the room. At the same time, something sits on the edge of my bed down by my feet. The weight remains unmoving, there is no sound. I slowly slide my foot towards it and encounter resistance. It's solid. I don't look, listen, or speak for maybe 10 minutes. My head is under the pillow. After what seemed like forever, I slide my foot over again, and it's gone, my foot moves freely. I get up, run downstairs, and never spend time on that second floor after dark ever again. I leave for college 8 months later and never return to that place. What's following me? Some kind of ghost has been showing up every couple of years since I was a kid, but it's not a dead relative or anyone I know. My first encounter was when I was 7 or 8 years old. Before getting to my personal encounter, my sister saw it. She was resting in her bed at night, and her wardrobe door suddenly flung open, and a girl was sitting in it. She ran out of the room to our parents, of course, and that's all I know of her encounter. On a different day, not sure when, but all encounters are pretty far apart, my mother heard a lot of noise coming from my bedroom like I was playing with my toys, but when I heard the noises, I went to my mother, and she looked at me confused and said she thought I was in my room. I went up to my room to see what the noise was and saw items thrown all over it. It was always clean, and a storage box was pulled completely out from under my bed. Now for my first encounter. I was lying in my bed asleep when I suddenly woke up. My door was wide open, and the hallway light was on, and a dark figure was standing in my doorway, staring at me. I stared back for a few seconds trying to identify the figure, thinking it was my dad, but I realized it had no features. Just a silhouette of a man. I was terrified and hid under my blanket and never came out until morning. Fast forward 5 years, my second encounter. I was using the bathroom on the top floor of my 3-story house. Only my mother was home, and she was on the bottom floor, so this next part can't be explained. The bathroom door unlocked itself, and the handle pulled down. I thought someone was trying to come in, though I don't know why they'd get a tool and unlock the door from the outside, so I held the door shut. After they stopped, I opened the door to see who it was, but there was nobody there. I checked the whole house only to find my mother making dinner in the kitchen. It was at this point I realized something followed me from my old home. The new home was newly built, so it couldn't be haunted already. Fast forward another 5 years, weird coincidence, and it's time for my third encounter. For a few weeks straight, my lights in my room turned themselves on at around 2:40 a.m. to 3:10 a.m., which I assumed was an electrical issue. My lights around my TV would also switch to full-speed flashing rainbow lights, which I thought meant the lights were cheap garbage. But then my main bedroom light started turning itself on whenever I left. I thought this couldn't be an electrical issue because it's almost like it's being controlled. I told my mother and sister about it, and they came to see it. The light started turning itself on and off rapidly, which freaked my sister out, and my mother, a psychic, told me to tell it to stop, so I did. And it listened. I've never had an issue with any lights since. But then later that year, I was returning to my house from the garage and looked at the glass back door of my house as I approached. I saw my brother standing in the doorway staring at me. I was confused as to why he was being weird, so I opened the door, and he was gone. I knew this could be a ghost, so I rushed upstairs to my brother's bedroom to see if he was there, and he was. He was in the middle of a game and said he was never downstairs. I asked my mother if she heard him use the stairs, and she said no. It's been 2 years since the last encounter. I saw something I cannot explain. When I was 10 years old, I saw something that to this day, 6 years later, I cannot still understand at all. I and my friends were outside playing, enjoying our time together, and for some context, the area I live in has one-way access, meaning the way you come in is the way you have to go out when you want to leave. And on this random day with my friends Nate and Donnie, we saw an old school, completely white, double-decker bus drive past the road we were walking on, and we just stood still in utter confusion because the way this bus came into our area was impossible. It physically couldn't drive into the area without driving through the entrance first, and it definitely did not do this. Inside this bus, there were 2 people, a male driver dressed as if he were in the 1920s. He was strangely completely white, with pale skin, snow-colored hair, and all white clothes. But he wasn't the most intriguing person on this bus. There was a woman extremely similar to him in that she was completely all white too, but she was a passenger, and she was acknowledging us, waving at us. I was completely dumbfounded. I just stood there in awe. I know it doesn't sound like it was that much of a spectacle, but I can't explain. This bus had an aura that was totally captivating. These people on the bus did not seem threatening at all. They seemed benevolent and had a feeling of warmth about them. This whole situation must have lasted maybe 5 seconds at most. It was a lot to take in such a short amount of time, and out of nowhere, as the bus went past us, it just suddenly disappeared. I can't explain it. It didn't fade away, it just disappeared. I hadn't shared this story with anyone until I recently shared it with my mother, who, unlike me, holds a strong belief in the supernatural. She informed me that around the same time, she experienced a dream in which her late mother, who passed away the month before my birth, told her, "I have to go. I have a bus I need to catch." I know it's a far-fetched theory to assume it was my grandmother, and I don't even know if I believe it in all honesty, but all I do know is that I definitely saw something that day, and whatever it wasn't as normal as we know it. Does anyone with more knowledge about these supernatural things have any theories about what I and my friends saw that day? I don't believe in ghosts, but I can't explain what I saw either. So when I was 13, I was having a lot of difficulty finding friends or making them, due to my hypnose, so I mostly played with my big brother and his friends. My brother is 2 years older than me and was part of the Boy Scouts, and naturally, since I didn't have any plans or anything with friends, my dad would let me tag along with him and my brother at the meetings, and the scoutmasters never really cared if I listened in or participated in the activities. I think my dad told them my situation, even though I was a girl. One day my dad had told me that the scout troop was going for a short camping trip and I was invited, and it'll be at a place called Fort Morgan located in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and since I love the beach, I was obviously excited. When we arrived at the destination, we were told that the only people allowed to camp in the old stone fort were only Boy Scouts, so this was a really special thing I was allowed to be a part of, I thought to myself. Before I continue with this story, I advise you read about this place. So that night my dad set up a tent for me and him, and the boys did the same, and we had a lot of fun playing capture the flag, hide and seek, etc. Around 11 o'clock the adults decided it was time for us to head to our tents because in the morning we would be going on a big beach hike. That night I couldn't sleep for some reason. I knew everyone was asleep, maybe there was 1 or 2 snickers I heard, but not much activity otherwise. My dad was out cold, so I had no one to talk to, so eventually I drifted off to a scorching and humid sleep. It was so humid at that place. All I can remember is waking up really chilly and scared, walking around the fort, corridors and everything. It was really weird. I can feel the light breeze of the salty wind, the wet stone on my feet, and eventually I walked into a courtyard. I remember seeing the moonlight lighting up the place, except the shadows of the wall, and that's when shit got weird. This tall, hooded black thing with bleeding legs and a hatred and yet sadness in its eyes came from the shadows and was sobbing. It looked at me, and I felt like all the kindness and compassion I ever felt in this world was rotten and false. It was a very complicated and confusing feeling for 13-year-old me. It then started to stumble towards me, and it finally reached me, and before I could do anything, I believed I passed out. The next morning when I woke up, my dad was waking me up for breakfast, but before I left the tent, he asked me if I was okay. A little confused, I said yes, and I had a really bad dream that night, and I asked what about, and I didn't really want to tell him. Then he told me that around 2:30 that morning I screamed like I was dying, and the ground shook like a cannonball hit the walls. He got his flashlight to check on me, and he said my back was arched like the chick from the demon movies. I'm not sure which one, but y'all know, and I was crying while my eyes were rolled back in my head. He shook me awake, and this was not abuse, he was very concerned for me, slapped me awake, and I looked at him and said, "Who are you? You're not God. Who are you?" And then I collapsed and went back to sleep, and then Caleb, the oldest scout there, started screaming in the tent furthest away, saying, "Jonathan, please make it stop." No one there was named Jonathan, and he didn't know anyone named that. Other than that horrible night, it was a good trip, but it still bothers me, my brother, and Dad, including the old scoutmaster. Literally every time I run into that man, he always mentions Fort Morgan. I'm now 22 and still have the same question: what was that thing? Strange activity in my best friend's house. Once every couple of weeks, I go over to visit my best friend's house and stay the night. Sometimes I'm alone, as he works night shifts and I look after his dog. The house is at least 10 years old, not ancient and creaky, but still with enough time for some unsettling things to happen. Strange presence. My best friend and I have experienced a string of unsettling events in his house, leaving us convinced it's not just him living there. He's heard voices late at night, like a few people talking. He has felt a heavy presence pinning him down in bed, making it difficult to breathe. He had to pray before it finally let him go. He once felt cold while asleep, and the corner of his covers was pulled back off of him. The kids have heard phantom footsteps racing through the house, from his bedroom all the way through the kitchen and lounge and up to their door. I've felt a chilling presence tugging at my covers and heard footsteps outside when no one was there. We both get inexplicable chills and goosebumps, especially when discussing the paranormal, but sometimes it happens randomly too. Sometimes we are just watching a movie together, and he or I feel cold air. Even his dog seems to sense something, staring intently into the kitchen as if watching something we can't see. Most creepy experience. Last night, I was sitting on the couch in the living room when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure, almost like a silhouette with a distinct outline, like a line drawing. It was leaning out from the couch, its head level with mine, staring directly at me. It must have been standing lower than normal, because its head was level with mine while I was sitting. I slowly turned my head to get a better look, but as I did, the figure seemed to move back into the couch, like it was standing back up from a leaning position. It was as if it had been watching me, and then, as if sensing my gaze, it retreated back into the couch. Later that night, I was still on the couch when I saw it again. This time, it was in the kitchen, which has an open plan with the living room. I caught a glimpse of the shadowy figure walking through the kitchen, again to the right side of my peripheral vision. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished when I turned my head to get a better look. My friend came home around 9 p.m., and he went straight to his bedroom. I went to the bathroom, which is on the opposite side of the house. Suddenly, I heard a voice, loud and clear, saying, "Out." It was a male voice, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I asked my friend if he had said it, but he said no. I was shocked. I'd never heard the spirit speak before. Later, I went outside for a cigarette. There was no wind, but the glass patio door started rattling. It was like someone was trying to get in, or maybe trying to get my attention. I'm not sure what to make of it. But one thing is for sure, something strange is happening in my best friend's house. And it's getting harder to ignore. First of all, should we be concerned? Secondly, what do you guys make of all this? Any advice? Thoughts? It seems to be getting worse anyway. The girl on the stairs. When I was in high school, I lived in a tiny town. I had my small group of friends and extremely strict parents. I was grounded most of my teen years and spent most of the time in my room. Now, I'm not exactly sure when all of this started, and I'm at a loss how to tell it. I guess I'll start with a little backstory. I have 7 siblings, however, at the time there were only 6 of us kids living there when it began. One day I had been doing my laundry. Our laundry room was in the basement. I began to feel as though I was being watched. I brushed it off because, well, it simply seemed silly. Not long after my sister told my mom that she had gotten up late at night and was in the kitchen when she heard singing coming from the garage. Since I was the only one in the house who sang almost all the time, she thought that it was me and went out to ask me what the hell I was doing in the garage so late at night. She told my mother that when she entered the garage, the singing stopped, and she looked around but saw no one. She later stated that it sounded like a young girl, which is also why she thought it was me. A few weeks went by without incident, and then my older brother had an experience. My mom owned a daycare at the time. We had a playground in the backyard for the kids to play in, and often our garage door was left open. My brother was coming home from work, and as he was walking up to the house, he thought he saw a child hiding in the corner of the garage. The children knew that they were not allowed in there due to obvious hazards. As he got closer, Asking what they were doing in there, he suddenly realized that there was no one in the garage. When asked about it later, he had stated that he thought it was a little girl. I had been blissfully unaware of this, as my mom had sworn them to secrecy due to the fact that the business she ran was from home, and she did not want it to tarnish the name of her daycare. I had not experienced much besides unease every time I went down into the basement. Often I would run back up the stairs after going down to do laundry or watch TV, and it was always with the feeling of something right behind me. Something bad. One Sunday I had decided to shrug off my uneasy feeling and go down into the basement so I could watch my show on Netflix. As the TV numbed my mind into stupidity, I forgot all about the horrifying terror. That is, until my brother got home. Now, the house that we lived in was from the late 1800s and had obviously been fixed up to accommodate modern society. One of the best things about it was that it had a huge open window out to the front yard and the street. If you stand at the front of the house, you can see straight through the living room, into the dining room, all the way to the back room that my parents used as their bedroom. So I'm sitting there watching TV in bliss when my brother comes downstairs and looks at me. He asks, "Were you just in the living room?" I was confused as I had been home all day doing nothing but watching TV, and no one else was home. I told him exactly that, and he gets weird. So of course I start asking. "Why? What's up?" "It's nothing," he says awkwardly. "Come on, tell me what's going on," I demanded. I just saw someone running around in the living room when I pulled up." My blood froze. It was a small town, so we never locked our doors. I hadn't heard anything, but my brother is a good guy, and he never lies. So we both get knives from the kitchen and begin to search the house. We come up with nothing. To this day he swears that he saw a little girl running around in the house through the living room window. Now I'm obviously not stupid, and I start prodding my parents for information. They refused to tell me and said that my brother must have just been imagining it. I let it go because one does not argue with my parents. Again, nothing happens for several more weeks. I started to feel comfortable again. One night I remember waking up because I needed water and had to use the restroom. At the time I had been sharing a room with my youngest sister. I got out of bed and went to the restroom. Afterwards I had walked downstairs to get some water, and as I was standing at the sink, I started to feel it. An awful feeling that was like every primal instinct in your body telling you to run. Telling you that whatever was behind you was the most evil thing that you could ever experience. I ran up the stairs, down the hall, and into my bedroom. Whatever it was had chased me, and I remember thinking, "You're supposed to be in the basement. Only in the basement." As I jumped on my bed, it felt as though it was going to jump on top of me. I turned and yelled, "Tu es de fila luna," which is Latin. Now I'm not fluent in any other language than English, and this line is something I had read out of a book series that I liked. It means you are a daughter of the moon. Or something to that effect. When this pushed out in a gasp, the evil that felt like it was suffocating me simply vanished. Because this seemed strange to me, I told myself that I had just freaked myself out and that I was tired. That it wasn't real. My last and final experience with this force came late one night when I had gotten done working the closing shift at my high school job. I walked home, and I was extremely tired, so when I got home, I announced to my brother, who was the only one home, that I was home and going to bed. He said okay, so I turned into the hallway, took off my shoes, and began crawling up the stairs like a drunken monkey. I was a weird kid. The stairs had two parts. The first 4 steps went into the wall and then turned to go up to the top floor. As I was crawling, I had my head hung low, thinking about how busy work had been, how I was going to continue reading my books, etc. Suddenly, as I reached the very top of the stairs, I came face to shoe with someone. I froze, and my breathing quickened. The shoe was black and old looking with buckles on it. I remember slowly looking up. My eyes following all the details my brain could comprehend, I was staring at a young girl. She had on white stockings and a navy blue dress. The dress was vintage in fashion. It looked like an old party dress that little girls would wear back in the 1700s to 1800s. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was staring ahead. Her hair was blonde, and it could have been up or down, but the length was to her shoulders. I can't tell you what her face looked like, because as I reached her shoulders, my hair was standing on end. While the feeling I got from her wasn't evil, it was extremely unnatural. I turned and fell down the stairs. I ran to my brother and burst into tears while telling him what had happened. What I had seen. He calmed me down and told me to go to bed. In the morning my mother was angry, asking me why I'd make things up. "Do you want to scare your little brother? He's only 7. Don't go telling anyone because I run a daycare here, and no one will want to bring their kids here if they think that it is haunted. It sounds worse than it is. My parents later told me of their own experience and the experiences of my baby brother, who was only 7 at the time. He told my parents that he had seen a skeleton in the window, and he would have nightmares. I moved out the day before I turned 18, and my parents later moved too. They have shared their stories with me and have both come to the conclusion that 2 of my older sisters most likely brought a Ouija board in the house. I have since been on one paranormal investigation and still hold my fascination with the supernatural. I do understand that it is dangerous and not to be taken lightly. I have never felt that feeling of pure evil again and pray that I never will. Possible entity chasing me at 3 a.m.? So basically it was Halloween night, and I, 15, male, and my cousins, 14-15, male, decided to sneak out around 3 a.m. to go down to the shop, and all was going well until we got about 1/3 of the way home. We were outside a church, and my cousin, 15, male, saw an elderly woman approximately in her 70s. She was holding a shopping bag and had brown curly hair down to her shoulders. BTW, we live in Ireland, so basically it was Samhain, and we walked for 5 minutes until my other cousin, 14, male, said to me, "There is a church," and my cousin, 15, male, saw an elderly woman following us, and I turned back, and sure enough, this woman was following us. So we started speed walking just so she doesn't think we were running away from her, and then she starts running at us. At this point, we were scared shitless because it was 3 a.m. in Ireland on Samhain/Halloween night, and this old lady in her 70s was chasing us, so we started running for our lives, and she kept running until she turned into my granny's yard, which was really creepy since she was the only one who lived there. But anyway, we made it home without anything serious happening, so we decided to tell ChatGPT what happened to us, and this is what it said, the following one. The witching hour, 3 a.m. is thought to heighten supernatural activity. An old woman's appearance may be linked to this time. 2. Old hag, sleep paralysis. The old hag often appears during sleep paralysis, causing fear and immobility. 3. Banshee, Celtic folklore. In Irish and Scottish lore, a banshee, sometimes an old woman, warns of death and may follow a person as an omen. 4. Ghostly apparition. Elderly spirits might appear due to unresolved issues or to warn, protect, or seek help. 5. Warning spirit. Some beliefs see these apparitions as warnings of danger or illness. Many cultures recommend prayers, amulets, or cleansing rituals to protect. Now we were freaking out even more when it mentioned all of this, so we decided to ask it more about banshees, and it said that they follow their victims as a warning sign that they shouldn't be doing something or that someone in the family is going to die. Then the next day, when all my cousins went, I heard news that a friend of my granny and mother had recently died due to cancer. Now, I didn't even know about this until that day, the day she died, and she was in her 70s also. Then today I came to this here to see what you guys think. I know most of you probably think this is BS or was just an old woman, but I believe she was more than that because, first of all, why would an old woman be out at 3 a.m. following a group of teenage boys, and also why would she run at us? Also, it was 3 a.m. on Halloween night in Ireland, which is the second most haunted country in the world, behind Germany, according to Google, so I don't know how accurate it is. Now I don't know if this is the best place for this story, but it was the only place I could think of. Anyway, let me know what you guys think this was. The field and the deer. This story happened 20 years ago, and I have not lived in the area for much of that time, so this is not current personal info. But I think that the location is relevant to the creepy feelings, and, of course, I encourage others to look up the references I bring up. I grew up on Long Island, New York. Long Island is already home to creepy stories such as the Amityville Horror House. I have countless stories of myself or friends/family checking out historic places back then, such as shut down asylums, haunted railway or highway crossings, Mary's grave, etc. And then, of course, there were random disappearances, some of which ended up being the Long Island Ripper, a case that recently got an alleged perpetrator. I didn't realize this at the time of this story, but the place my friends and I went to was in the same category as all of these unsettling things. To be clear, I have no idea if this was supernatural or not, but the history I'll later explain creeps me out either way. Every St. Patrick's Day, my mother, her friends, their kids, and any of my friends who wanted to tag along would go out to Montauk for the big parade. Montauk is gorgeous, by the way, and the sunset is allegedly famous. One of my mother's friends owned a room in another famous attraction, the Montauk Manor, and we all went to visit after a long day of shenanigans. My friends and I, being teenagers, still had energy to spare, so we asked if we could rent tennis rackets, and just play around on the completely empty court. There were 4 of us, so we just played 2v2 of whack the ball as hard as we could at each other. Most of the balls went over the massive chain-link fences because of our ridiculousness, and I didn't want my mother's friend to get in trouble for us losing the balls, so I asked my friends to split up and collect them all. I think we had a batch of a specific number, maybe 10 or 20, so we knew how many to look for. I took the neighboring field and grumbled in teenage angst about why there would be a tall, wheat yellow grass field right next to a tennis court, with a 10 feet tall fence, mind. I managed to find a lot of the balls we were looking for right on the edge of the tall grass, so I tossed them behind me onto the asphalt and figured a bunch probably rolled into the field itself, so I went onto this neighboring property to look. I was alone, and I can't explain this any better, but I felt compelled to look up from my ground search and look out to the field. There was a large rock, unsure if it counted as a boulder, that stuck out from the 5 feet plus tall grass, right in the middle of the field, maybe 100 to 200 feet away, and although I'd seen it before, I was stunned to see a figure sitting on top of this rock. I can see this in my mind's eye to this day. It was a very lanky figure, presumably male from the short hair, and either wearing a very tight shirt or nothing on top. Whatever the bottoms were, they looked like some sort of skirt or kilt-looking item that stopped around the knees. I can't describe much more because the figure was unnaturally dark, as if no light penetrated this strange silhouette while the sun was still very much up and shined on both of us. I didn't register the darkness at first because the second I looked up and my eyes locked onto this person, the figure quickly slid off of the rock, and I saw the tall grass shaking towards my direction. My immediate thought was, oh shit, that's the farmer's son, and I shouldn't be in this field, so I turned to make a quick exit. I went into the field on a diagonal, so when I turned, it was a new path out as I tried to escape any potential consequences. On the short route back, I came to a halt at an extremely disturbing sight. In a gap in the tall grass was a dead deer, and, right next to it, a very old-looking tennis ball, likely not one of ours. The sight made me freeze, and in the moment I did a quick scan to try to understand what I was seeing. I eventually focused on something I couldn't explain in the moment. There was a hole in its chest right between the front legs, but there was no blood or smell or flies. This is where I lost whatever cool I had and started screaming to my friends to go, run, we need to get out of here. The panic in my voice apparently convinced them very quickly. Back at the manor door, I explained what I saw. They were questioning why I screamed at them, especially when I insisted that we look for the tennis balls, but after explaining the deer, they were pale and silent. Chalking it up to teenage energy plus stupidity, and probably myself still running on adrenaline, my friends eventually said they needed to see this deer, and I agreed to show them the area I was in. I told them we can try to find it again, but someone saw me on the property, so we shouldn't trespass or anything. After a good couple of minutes to calm down, we went back over and were still on the manor's asphalt paving, just peering around to see if we could spot the deer through the grass. My friend actually did, and we found out that it was one row away and easily visible if we used our arms to push some grass aside. I looked up again, not compelled but probably paranoid, to look at the rock and to make sure the only grass that was moving was due to the wind. Then we stepped back into the field to get a good look at this thing. We were all creeped out by the lack of blood despite a cavernous hole being there. There just wasn't any evidence of violence at all. There was nothing on the ground or around this hole on the fur, just a dark, empty space where fur, and other things like tissue, should be. After a couple of quiet minutes, someone said, I honestly can't remember if it was me or my friends, that's where the heart would be. I remember a coldness going over me then, and suddenly I was no longer interested in what happened here. It felt to me like everyone got this feeling, and while there was a, now funny to me, morbid question of should we grab the tennis ball? We all left without another word to each other. After the shock wore off and we were walking through the manor and back to my mother's friend's room, we talked about how crazy that is. But that was the last we spoke of it. Until I googled Long Island haunted places one day, years later. I don't remember the reasoning now, but knowing me, I was probably looking for a cool place to drive to that night. On the site the Montauk Manor was listed, and that cold feeling washed over me again. I read about how the place was built upon countless Native American graves, how rituals were often done on the old and new grounds, and how shadow people were seen in the manor's hallways. We didn't see the latter, but the rest of it made me question a lot of what I saw that cold March day. I immediately messaged two of the friends who went with me with "Do you remember that time?" and they were absolutely baffled at the news, which was validating for me lol. It's become a cool, niche legend for us, but at the same time, none of us have ever gone back. Wanted to share this experience and get some people's thoughts. Back when I waitressed, I pulled into my mom's driveway around 8 p.m., and I remember I was excited because it was an early night for me, and I'd been working 3 jobs at the time. The neighborhood was quiet, and no one else was around, no cars driving by. I was scrolling on my phone in my car when I got a terrible feeling and a chill down my spine. Something was telling me to get out of the car. I got out and slammed my door when I heard this gut-wrenching scream. I thought a raccoon was being eaten, or a cat had gotten run over. I couldn't pinpoint what it was because it was so disturbing. I'll never forget it. It had so much pain and terror in it. I looked around me to find the source and noticed a figure across the street, standing in the grass next to the street curb. The streetlight was in front of my house, so I could make out some details. It was a girl with long hair covering her face and a long white dress. She had on no shoes. My first thought was kidnap victim for some reason, and I wanted to call out, "Are you okay?" But something inside told me to hold back. She didn't move or look up. I probably stood there a minute too long contemplating what I was seeing and if she needed help or not, but ultimately my gut told me to get inside, now. Without turning my back to her, I opened my garage door and backed in, my eyes never leaving her, and she didn't move. I stood and watched as the garage door closed and she was still there. I ran inside, turned on the house alarm, and ran to the front window to see if I could see her, but I couldn't. Then I ran to my bedroom window upstairs because I would have a perfect view of her, but she was gone. I slept with the lights on that night. My mom says the neighborhood kids were playing a prank, but none of them looked like her. I've seen them all. When I told the story to some friends, some of them mentioned Banshee. While no one in my family passed away, I had a near-death experience 3 months later. Curious as to what others think, was I being pranked, or did I see something that night? And if I did, what exactly did I encounter and why? A supernatural experience. Between 2006 and 2009, I experienced a supernatural experience that was shared by 5 others. To start the story, I went to go see some friends down in Kentucky after I got done with high school. Spent a week there. Had a ton of fun with them in the small town. One of them told me about a satanic black metal band that he was digging at the time. I don't remember if he told me that it was a satanic band or not. But we listened to the CD for a while when I was down there. About 3 to 6 months after that, my sis had a severe autoimmune disease that she was fighting with. One day during the summer, my brother and I had some friends over to play Def Jam on the Xbox, the first one, and at that time it was after I got a copy of the CD. At the time, I didn't know it was a satanic band. It was about 9:45 p.m/10:30 p.m. when I turned off the music. About a minute or less, we heard footsteps on the main floor. At this time, I want to give the layout of where we were living at. At the time, my mom was a house manager for a group home for mentally handicapped adults. My sister, brother, and I slept in the basement, the clients lived on the main floor, and my parents lived in their little apartment on the top part of the house. There was a garage as well. There were clients living over the garage, then the laundry room, then the living room, the kitchen, and then the dining room. To get to our rooms down in the basement, you have to go through the kitchen and go down the stairs to get to the basement. When you open the door to the basement, you would walk into my sister's room immediately. Then my brother's room and lastly mine. We were playing games in my brother's room. So when I turned off the music, we heard heavy, hard steps above our rooms. Since we lived in the house for some time at this point, we know who sounds like what. The footsteps came from the living room to the kitchen. 4 of us heard it. We all looked at each other and knew 100% we were not going crazy. Then the footsteps started up again near the stairs to my sister's room, and within about 5 seconds after that, my sister started to scream bloody murder. Keep in mind that my sister was so sick that she couldn't walk, stand, or hardly move on her own due to her body attacking her liver. We rushed into the room, and it was just her lying in her bed. I took her up to our parents' room, and the 4 of us grabbed Bibles and started walking around the house and started to bless the windows and doors. When I went to the front door of the house that was between the living room and the laundry room, about halfway there, a wolf's head appeared at eye level with me. I am 5 feet 3 inches tall and have a good eye for how big/tall people and things are. If you know how big a timber wolf's head was, this was bigger than that by about 1/3, give or take. It appeared snarling and drooling for a split second at eye level. I jumped up and back. I eminently rebuked it and told it that it was not welcome in this house, and by the blood and in the name of Jesus, it had to leave. During that whole time, there was a heavy feeling around the house. Like a heavy fog, but we felt it on our bodies and souls. When my sister woke up the next day, she said that a black shadow in the corner of her room had red eyes near the ceiling. From the floor to the ceiling was about 8-ish feet tall. She said it was about 3 feet wide. She said that it told her that it would get the whole family and kill us and eat us in front of her and save her last. I was wondering if anyone else had something like this happen to them. Does anyone know what the wolf-like head was in the supernatural realm? Finally, Does anyone know what it was in my sister's dream that prompted her to scream bloody murder from a sound sleep? The Bridge of Shadows, a night I'll never forget. I live in a city in India, where life doesn't stop no matter the hour. It was a cold winter evening, and I was at my desk, sipping coffee, lost in my own world. My mom called out and asked me to get some medicine for her. Being the procrastinator that I am, I pushed it off, saying I'd go later. Time passed quickly, and before long, it was 11 p.m. The streets were quiet, with the kind of eerie calm that only comes late at night. I grabbed my jacket and my bike keys and headed out to the 24/7 medical store nearby. After picking up the medicine, I felt the urge to go for a late-night ride, something I often do to clear my head. There's a small bridge not too far from my place, surrounded by towering trees and shadowed by tall buildings in the distance. The bridge has a kind of haunting beauty to it, especially at night. Beneath it runs a dam, and when it's open, the rushing water creates a mesmerizing, soothing symphony. Here's where things get unsettling. In India, we don't bury the dead, we cremate them. And this bridge? It has 4 cremation sites around it, 2 at either end of the bridge. I didn't think much of it. I'm not superstitious, and honestly, I never believed in ghosts. It was midnight when I arrived. I parked my bike near the start of the bridge, lit a cigarette, and put on some music. The cold breeze whispered through the trees, and the distant sound of water made the setting almost surreal. At the far end of the bridge, I noticed a pyre burning, a body being cremated. I decided to stay where I was and not disturb the rituals. An hour passed, and I felt it was time to head home. But to do that, I'd have to pass the cremation site. I started my bike and began riding slowly. The closer I got, the more aware I became of the burning pyre. Suddenly, a shadow caught my attention. Initially, I believed it was a trick of the lighting. But as I got closer, the shadow became clearer, a man, squatting right next to the burning pyre. I slowed down to get a better look, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. He was scratching his head, violently, almost like he was trying to tear his scalp off. His movements were frantic, jerky, and unnatural. His hair was catching fire from the pyre, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he rocked back and forth, making these guttural, animalistic sounds. My heart froze. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. Then, he turned. In a flash, faster than anything I've ever seen, he snapped his head toward me. I'll never forget the sound, a sharp, crackling zap, like static electricity. His face was illuminated by the flames, and his eyes. His eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. I don't know how, but I managed to kill my headlights and twist the throttle, desperate to get away without drawing his attention. But as I passed him, I felt it, a cold, piercing gaze, as if he was looking straight into my soul. I didn't dare look back. My hands trembled, my body was drenched in sweat despite the cold, and I rode faster than I ever have, praying he wouldn't follow. When I reached home, I locked every door and window, my heart still pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a high fever that lasted 2 days. When I finally gathered the courage to visit the bridge in daylight, there was nothing. There were no signs of anyone present, and there was no evidence to support what I had witnessed. To this day, I don't know if it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely. But one thing is certain, I'll never go near that bridge at night again. I was marked. I had a supernatural experience many years ago, and I am still not able to wrap my head around it. This happened over a decade ago. I was a college student back then. My finals had just gotten over, and we had moved from the university hostel. I and 2 of my friends were renting a room close to the university. Since it was summer holidays, my roommates had left for home, and it was just me staying because I wanted to work a job during the off days and earn some money. The landlord lived on the ground floor, and we lived on the top floor, which was divided into 3 separate rooms. We had taken the largest one. A week or so after moving there, I found a job. I started going, and it had been a few days. Nothing remarkable happened. After a couple of days of joining, I found out that the recruitment company I was working for was actually a con job. They would take donations from poor, uneducated people who desperately wanted to get a job and make them work as salesmen, who could only get paid through commissions on the sales they made. Once they found out the con, they would call the company phone continuously, but we were cautioned to not pick up. I felt guilty about the job and was thinking of finding another one. On the 4th day or so, I got a call from such a disgruntled recruit, who had pawned his wife's jewelry to get that job. He had called from a different number, so I picked up, and he went off on me. He yelled at me and cursed me and my potential generations to come. I could tell he was livid, and all I could do was apologize and disconnect the call. I felt awful about it. Exhausted, I came back to the room, had a sandwich and milk for dinner, and watched Shutter Island on my laptop. I fell asleep watching the movie. I closed all the doors and windows. I had terrible dreams that night. I even remember them vividly. I was wearing a black dress in my dream and a pearl choker while looking into a mirror in a dark room, and as I watched my reflection in the mirror, it slowly morphed into a scary, twisted, disfigured mask while I started to choke myself with the pearl choker I wore. I had never had such a dream before. I woke up from the nightmare, and as soon as I woke, I felt a presence next to me. It was pitch black, so I couldn't see anything, but I clearly felt a presence. I am not a nervous person and have a strong heart. So even though I was startled, I didn't lose my senses. I lay there for a few seconds just to get my thoughts together. And then I felt something on my arm. It felt like a fingernail leisurely touching / lightly scraping my left forearm, like a gentle exploratory touch. My body locked itself for a few seconds from fear. And then just as suddenly, I gathered my senses and sprang up from my bed. Adrenaline coursing through my body, I quickly switched on all the lights and started screaming for the presence to show itself. I looked at my phone. It was exactly 4:10 in the morning. After I looked around, I finally looked at my arm where it had touched me. There was an 1.5 inch long red mark there, 1/2 centimeter wide. And I lost it. I went to the washroom to treat it. It didn't burn or sting or anything. It was just a red mark that didn't go away even after soaping. I felt as if marked. I was terrified and flustered. I slept in my neighbor's room that night. I had terrible nightmares that time too. Since there was only one bed there, we both slept in the same one. And I kept dreaming that the person sleeping next to me morphed into a bald and demonic figure, trying to devour me. I left the room the next morning and went to stay over with a friend and then went home after I booked my tickets. Obviously, quit the job. For many years after that, I had trouble sleeping. I was never scared of the dark before that. But after that incident, if I was alone, I would sleep with the lights on. Often, I would wake up from my sleep at exactly 4:10 a.m. I am sure that part was psychological. The mark stayed on my arm a few weeks and then faded, just like some old scar mark. Faded completely. I am a pretty skeptical person and quite evidence-driven. But I still couldn't explain what happened that night. I know there was something there. I just do. After many years, now, I don't feel as scared and have taken it in my stride for the most part. But I still cannot explain what happened that night. I am hypervigilant, though. And I feel like I can sense spaces. I can feel vibes coming off from spaces and people. If it feels like bad vibes, I keep my distance. I am certain that this is primarily a psychological issue. But I do trust my instincts more. I still cannot sleep without a nightlight, though, and my cats are pretty fierce about any strange sound in the flat, so I feel a bit protected. I also live in a flat where there are a lot of strange noises, although I must say they are infrequent since I adopted my cats. I used to get scared sometimes before, I don't anymore. I even threaten no one in my flat that if anything untoward happens to my cats, even if that entity is dead, I would ruthlessly kill it again. Lol. I remembered this incident today because my maid told me today that she feels spooked in the house when I am not there. The funny thing is that my former maid said the same thing. Maybe they are just nervous more than anything else. But I also keep feeling weird things, I just don't react to them anymore, like I used to. 'Cause I feel like I will duck them up if I find them. Haha. It has been quite a while since I woke up at 4:10 a.m. I don't try to rationalize it anymore. But it would be helpful to know if someone else has been through something similar. Any kind of explanation would be nice. I swear I saw her. When I was around 10 years old, I was alone in a part of the schoolyard during the morning break. In the country I lived back then, it was common for schools to have two breaks, a 30 to 45 minutes long one in the morning, and a 1 hour long one at lunchtime. There was a tall, huge tree there, and I was sitting on one of the large roots that stuck out of the ground when I heard someone approaching. I turned to see who it was, and I saw it was one of my friends. She said, "I bet you can't catch me." I told her I could do it, and we started running around the tree while I tried to reach her and catch her. We were both laughing, and she was right, she was too fast for me to reach her. Then, one of my classmates called my name. I stopped running and turned around, and the boy who called my name asked, "What are you doing running around the tree by yourself?" I was about to tell him I was not alone when I saw that my friend, who I thought was there with me just a few seconds ago, wasn't there. It was really strange. I just told the boy it wasn't important and I felt like doing it. Later that day, I saw my friend, and she came and said, "How have you been?" It was like she hadn't seen me that day. I didn't say anything about it or about what had happened earlier, but while we were talking, She mentioned that she had spent the break in her classroom, talking with some of her friends, and it was true. I asked one of the friends later. This made me think I was crazy or something, as it was impossible that she could be in two places at the same time. Several years have passed since that day, and I still can't find an explanation for what happened, and I have never told anyone about it. I don't know if it was something supernatural, a glitch in the matrix, or if I just imagined it, but what I do know is that I saw her. I would appreciate if anyone could help me to understand what happened. I think I met a supernatural being in New Orleans. I encountered a person/angel/demon/parallel universe person/alien a few years ago in New Orleans. It's a moment that I simply can't get out of my head, but I haven't been ready to talk about because the entirety of the experience sounds crazy, and I'm generally a rational human being. No one in my circle of family or friends knows what I went through in the first 4 years of my relationship, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. I'm hoping someone can identify what exactly happened and perhaps talk me out of believing that this was a supernatural experience. A few years ago, my husband and I were on our honeymoon. While things are fantastic now, they haven't always been. My husband had a lot of emotional baggage from his youth, as did I. While I tend to internalize things, my husband is the opposite and was often taking his anger out on me. He was an alcoholic, cheated on me, did more than a few things to break my trust, was emotionally abusive, and was part of the reason I spiraled into a deep depression. While I probably should have left him instead of marrying him at the time, I'm glad I didn't. He's worked on himself significantly, and although he does lose his temper every now and then, it's no longer directed at me. He's not a villain. The backstory is to allow you to understand why I still question to this day what happened. It was our second, or third, day in the city. We were starting our day, walking from the Marigny to the French Quarter. I decided to go into a few stores while my husband smoked a cigarette and waited for me. As I came out to meet him, he was talking to a very tall man with long straw blonde hair in his mid-40s or so with a dog on the edge of the sidewalk while he leaned against the storefront. I love talking to people, so as I joined him, I invited him to come on into my bubble, because I say weird things like that. This was my first inkling that something was off. He looked at me intensely and said to me, "Don't ever say that. You never know what you're inviting over." And came closer all the same. The rest of the conversation was weird, to say the least. It was not quite esoteric in nature, but it felt like the things he was saying could be either brushed off as a crazy man in need of medication or that he was a soldier who had lived a rough life. I don't particularly remember what he said other than it was off. At some point he asked me if I knew what I was wearing around my neck. I said yes, of course, it's the tree of life. I made it. I can't remember the details of exactly what he said, but after this he looked at me and then looked at my husband and said to me, "Why are you here?" I replied that it was our honeymoon and that we were married. I remember feeling the weight of those words on my chest at that moment. I remembered the heartbreak and everything that had transpired in our relationship, and we shared a moment where it was as if he read my mind and knew. He gave me a look of what I can only describe as empathy or sympathy. He looked at me and said, You're full of light. Your heart is full of light." He turned to my husband, "But your heart is darkness." He turned back to me at that point and said, so only I could hear, "Do you want me to swap some of that out so things are more balanced?" He looked at me intensely. Like this was a heavily weighted question with consequences. I'm not sure what compelled me to do so, but I nodded yes. At that point he touched both of us in the spot of our third eyes and told me it was done. I looked him directly in the eyes, face to face, for the first time since we started to talk. He was at least 6 feet 5 inches, so I had to crane my neck up to look at him. It was then that I realized how strange they were. His pupils were red. Not black or reflecting light or anything. They were bright red. The color of the iris was like mine, blue with spots of brown, which is not very common. I said to him, "Hey, your eye color, it's the same as mine." Not brave enough to ask about the pupils. He looked genuinely surprised that I was able to notice his eyes. It was like he pondered this for a moment and then shrugged as he said to me the weirdest thing. "Maybe you're a descendant." As he walked away with his dog, he yelled, "By the way, I never wash my hands." He laughed. See, here's the thing, though, the rest of the day, well into the evening, we both tingled everywhere. Like not quite an itch, but it was like something starting from the spot he touched us and working its way down our body until it was at our feet and then left. I kid you not, about a week later, things slowly started improving with our relationship. While I don't doubt that it's mostly because of my husband's effort for change, part of me wonders if the catalyst wasn't that moment in New Orleans. Funny thing is, my husband doesn't remember any of the weird stuff. He remembers the homeless guy and that he was weird, but he doesn't remember any of the spiritual stuff he said to me or the color of his eyes or anything. Not even how tall and imposing he was. I mean, dude looked like a Viking. Who exactly did I meet? A chance encounter, supernatural. I have 2 kids who have ASD, and we have had numerous supernatural occurrences. A few years back we lived next to a beautiful park. At the back of the park, it looked onto an exclusive gated community and had a long road lined with palm trees that would take you to this community or to a high-end shopping center for the wealthy. One night I was outside hanging washing when I heard a car speeding and then a large crash. The horn of the car wouldn't stop, and I could see vaguely through the trees the headlights of a car and clouds of smoke coming from the wreck. Within minutes sirens were heard, and I could hear people trying to talk to the driver, who was unconscious. The next morning I found out that the young man died at the scene of the accident as he lost control and hit one of the palm trees. He was separated from his wife and had 2 small children. I remembered his name and looked at his picture, stunned that this is the face of the man I heard the night before recklessly speeding. A few months later, my 4-year-old son was on the deck, and it was padlocked to stop him from escaping. I was talking to my 9-year-old daughter at the time in the lounge room when we heard a man's voice outside. We looked at each other, and he was talking to my son. The first thing that entered my mind was stranger danger, so we quickly ran outside to see my son by himself on the balcony. We looked around, and there was no one there, and it was impossible for a person to disappear so quickly into the park without being seen. I asked my son who he was talking to. He said a nice man came over to him and was talking to him from the bottom of the stairs. I asked him what he said. He asked me his name and how I liked living so close to the park. By this time, the hairs were standing on the back of my neck. My daughter looked at me concerned as she knew what was coming next. "Sweetheart," I said to my son, "where is he?" He said, "Mom, he said he had to go and just disappeared." "Okay, did he tell you his name?" "Yes," he said, and my son repeated the name, and the color drained out of my face. I never told the kids about the accident as they were in bed. It was the name of the young man who died in the car accident behind our home a few months before. My reaction was, "Quick, kids, time to get inside," as I shuffled them into the house and locked the door. Which is ridiculous because it was as if that was going to stop someone who had passed over from coming inside. I quickly changed the subject and got my son busy playing with his toys. I told my daughter quietly what had happened a few months before and that it was he who was outside talking to her brother. My daughter confirmed that she also heard the voice, and we were quite spooked for the rest of the day until my husband came home from work. This story is 100% true, and my son never saw the young man who lost his life to a reckless car accident again. I feel blessed that he chose my son to talk to. Whispers in the forest. I've come here to tell this story finally, as I want an explanation or want to hear a similar experience. So this story is from my teens. Nearly 10 years ago I would have been 14 or close to it at that time. I must have been on school break, but I remember hanging out at my friend Chris's place with another friend of ours named Sexton. Chris was considered wealthy. Rich to me as a little 13-14-year-old. He had a big-ass quad bike we would always take out exploring the bushland with. This is imported for later. So we ended up deciding to go swimming one afternoon. There was an old quarry that had filled up and was a popular swimming spot for local teens growing up. He lived not far out of town but was considered rural living. Everyone lived on small acreage around the area, semi-country living. The trek to get there was too far to walk. Easily accessible on the quad, though. It was early afternoon when we decided to go. This quad was only meant to fit 2 but easily managed 3 young teenage boys. I remember sitting on one back side while Sexton sat on the other side and Chris rode. The fastest way there was through a pine forest and then down some back roads into dirt roads and so on. This story isn't about the quarry itself or the back roads but the forest. This sinister, dark, almost Blair Witch type of forest. This pine forest was notorious for scary stories growing up. I remember my older brother telling me how he and his friend were on dirt bikes and saw dead animals hanging from trees. Pigs and dogs, or something similar to a dog, he said. Another Chris's older brother told me, one night he was taking his girlfriend through there on his dirt buggy when he came across and swore by this, a group of hooded people in a circle, cult, ritual stuff. He immediately did a 180 and drove as fast as he could out of there. All tales to stew the mind at night to me at this point. That was until I experienced my own set of unexplained events. This particular day we decided to go to the quarry for a swim as the day I experienced something supernatural. I remember vividly as we left his front gates onto the seemingly quiet country roads. Everything was good. We were young adolescent teens heading to the local swim spot on school break. Approaching the forest, I grew more immature and started to show off to Chris and Sexton. yelling out to the forest, "Come get us!" "And where are you?" "We aren't scared." As we were rapidly approached. As you enter this forest, no matter the time of the day, the shade from the ever-growing trees darkens the surroundings around. Having been a popular hiking and trail track, there are many different paths you can easily get lost on, even for a local. As we went through the forest on the quad bike, I continued my cheeky remarks and mockery while my friends were bursting in laughter and thrill. There wasn't anything unusual yet. We often were jokers and were the usual sporty class clown kids, so this was common behavior to us at the time. We went swimming for what must have been many hours, jumping off the cliff and climbing back up. It got late, dark almost. We decided it was time to head home. The journey would take roughly 35 minutes each way on the quad. For whatever reason, Chris told me to ride the quad back, and he wanted to chill on the back. Me being a motorhead, I loved it. I wasn't shy of the throttle and was hammering it to get us back before dark. Subconsciously, we all didn't want to be in the forest after the sun went down, that's for sure. As it goes, the sun sets, and we only just started the trek through the forest part. Chris mentioned at one point where the path we were on had really overgrown to not slow down. I chuckled and sped up. Just a few moments later, out of nowhere, and I mean nowhere, a massive chunk of the oversized mud-built tire had been taken out, almost like a rip, not a puncture but a large rip. It was like one moment we were cruising along and the next we hear and feel this thud that doesn't stop. The path had a very sharp turn coming up, and like I said, this particular part of the forest was heavily overgrown, to the point you were in a tunnel of leaves and branches. I thought to let it roll to a stop and turn the sharp corner with my two friends still on the back. We turned and saw a man and woman waving us down. They were sitting on the ground. As we got closer, I noticed a kid who looked maybe 10 or so. It was very odd, but we soon realized their mountain bikes and helmets and put two and two together. The man had crashed and had badly sprained his ankle to the point he couldn't bear any weight on it. Chris immediately went to help, and we followed him. They explained how she wasn't familiar with the tracks, and only her husband knew. Chris offered to show her how to get out, and I and Sexton stayed to offer assistance. Being only 13-14 at the time, there wasn't much we could actually do medically. Now this span of what felt like a whole night of torture happened over 2 to 3 hours waiting for Chris to get back with the woman and her car. We spoke with the injured man and his young son at the start, but the discomfort he was in made it difficult to actually converse. His son was overly concerned, as expected, and stayed by his dad very closely this whole time of waiting. As a few moments passed by and the sound got quiet, my mind started to wander on the tales of this pine forest, the type of forest you drive past and see the pine trees in perfect rows, expecting to see someone standing there. I started to hear distant barking from afar. Living rural, this wasn't unusual, so I genuinely didn't think anything of it. I started to hear talking from deep in the bush. My initial thought was, it's people on their property not too far. All seemed fair at this point. I was in small talk with Sexton when all of a sudden I heard the same sound of people, only this time it was quieter yet closer. I turned on the bright LED lights and repositioned the quad to face the direction of the bush I heard the sound from. I told Sexton but didn't mention it to the man and kid for two reasons. 1. They had no response to it, nor did it even look like they heard what I heard. 2. Me still thinking it's nothing, I didn't want to startle the already uncomfortable pair. Now Sexton is a wuss. The moment we left, he began to shake. A tree branch breaking would have been enough for him. A few more moments had passed, and I heard the same thing, this time one after another and so on. I turned and said to the man and child, "Did you hear that?" They both looked at me with confusion. I continued to tell the man I heard whispers from those bushes, and all he could say was that it was probably a gathering on one of the nearby properties. But I know what I heard, and by the look on Sexton's face, he did too. At this point I'm on edge. Sitting on the seat of this quad, trying to distract my mind. Then again, whispers from a group of people, only this time behind me. I immediately turned the quad on and did a 180 and shone the bright lights in that direction. Sexton is trying to persuade me to leave, whilst I persuade him to wait a little longer for Chris to get back. Again the son and father are completely oblivious to this. This continued on for a bit, me turning the quad around to face whatever direction we kept hearing the whispers from. It then settles. Completely silent. I faintly eavesdrop on the conversation between the son and father, and I can gather they are in their own worlds. Shocked by this, I finally speak up and tell them. I immediately felt embarrassed, but Sexton's raw look of fear confirmed what I was saying, and the injured man tried to reassure us it was nothing. After 20 minutes of silence, I and Sexton begin talking about the possibilities of the whispers, scaring each other endlessly without realizing it. After I thought it was over, a still dead feel surrounded us, And we heard the same whispers, only way louder and way clearer, all around us at the same time. It was coming from up high in the trees and deep in bushes, everywhere all at once, so loud and clear but not English nor anything I'd ever heard. I deemed it speaking in tongues, due to later self-research I did as an adult, so clear it was like someone was whispering to me. I looked at Sexton to see his jaw falling to his knees and his eyes staring at me, wanting to cry but not being able to move. His first words were, "Bro, we got to get the duck out of here." My flight was racing and my initial thought was run until I remembered Chris. I managed to compose myself and calm Sexton down. At this point the injured man was in a lot of pain, so he wasn't any help, nor was his young son. I told Sexton if Chris wasn't here in the next 5 minutes, we were going. I must have told him that every 5 minutes a few times. It worked, though. We saw car lights appearing, and at this point I didn't care who it was. Lucky it was Chris and the lady. Chris had this big smile on his face like we just made each other laugh. We didn't have a moment to explain what happened as the man was everyone's priority, and getting him into the backseat wasn't an easy task for us. We got him in, and as Chris was waving them off, I and Sexton were nagging at his arm, telling him to listen. He finally looked at us angrily and confused before I told him we needed to go. He looked at Sexton and didn't hesitate twice, charging after the car and asking for a quick lift to the closest road. We got to the road and got reception to phone his older brother. We explained the story, and he and his mates came with a trailer to collect us and the quad as well. Boy, did we feel safe seeing all of Chris's brothers and their mates rock up. We loaded up the quad, and I and the boys jumped in the back of the overloaded ute as we made our way out of the forest. As we were leaving, I looked into the bushes and saw a tall black figure. Shaped like a big man in the shadows, just standing there watching as we drove past. In shock, I didn't move or realize what I had just seen before looking at Sexton, who was already looking at me with that same look. I simply said, "You see that too," as he nodded slowly with teary eyes. The next day we spoke about it except for Sexton. He still had that scared look and was in complete disbelief. It's been at least 8.5 years since it happened, and I and Sexton haven't spoken about it since. To this day it was unexplainable, and I've never been back there. I haven't really had any strange place encounters, but a strange one that happened for me once was to do with a recurring dream. I was in my house, but it was in some weird suburb instead. I live in the UK, so it was really out of place to see a council house there lol. All that I know happened for the first few times was just wandering around and always waking up back in bed the next time. These dreams happen maybe once or twice a week, apart from the last time, where I woke up on the kitchen floor. I was confused, so I went outside for a bit. I've always been able to have really lucid dreams, so this wasn't really abnormal to me, but after some walking and finding nothing, I turned to head back, and that's when I kept hearing this clicking. Think when you pop a bone, but more crisp sounding. No matter how many times I looked back, I couldn't find the source, so I just kept going. It stopped when I was back in the house, but it felt off, like uncanny almost. Of course I knew I was dreaming, so I didn't get all that freaked out. I just decided to head to my room again. So I started walking upstairs, and that's when the clicking started again, so above halfway up, I quickly turned, and I was suddenly filled with fear. I didn't see anything that I remember. This is honestly the part I struggle to remember, but I just remembered this horrible primal fear, so I sprinted up those damn stairs, crashed into the wall, and knocked a paint. As luck would have it, my room was at the end of the hall, so it took a few seconds to get there. By the time I did, the clicking was at the pace of a clock ticking. I ran into, or rather through, my bedroom door and heard the thing thud into it, then like a scratchy climbing sound, then something scratching the little window. I have a small window above my door, if you know, you know, and after that, silence. I woke up not long after, and the first odd thing was that I had fallen asleep in front of my door. Despite going to bed previously, the second odd thing was chips of paint and wood outside my door, but the door itself was completely fine, and the third was the fact that the painting I had bumped into was no longer straight but slightly tilted. Nothing else came from it, but it was still a strange experience. I have never been able to explain it really. I have plenty of dream and odd spooky stories like this, but this one always stuck out as one of the few that really stuck. Probably a few details I missed, but this was almost 2 years ago, so I'm giving myself a pass. I only call this a supernatural dream because of other weird encounters I have had in this house that just don't make much sense. Supernatural experience. I have a question that I have always wanted to discuss and talk openly about, but nobody in my circle seems to have gone through anything similar. So I'm in my 30s now, and for the most part, I forget and don't think about this weird time, but every now and again I have a few hours of obsessing over it. This might be a little long. When I was a little girl, we would spend every weekend at my grandma and granddad's home. My mom was an only child, so it was only me and my brothers, no cousins. Which made us very close to our grandparents. I and my 4 brothers, I was the only girl, would all go on a Friday night, but on Saturday my brothers would leave and I would stay until Sunday night. It was mainly when they had left that this would happen to me. I would get severely depressed. Remember, I was only around 6 years old. My grandparents were wonderful and kind and doting, but their house. It was their house. I would think about dying all the time whilst I was there and have actual panic attacks where I would jump out of bed and run to the landing and scream for my grandma. I had my own bedroom, and it felt like there was something awful in there. I need to make it clear that when I was at my mother's home, I never felt like this. I never experienced anything like this anywhere else. My grandparents' bathroom was opposite their bedroom, and sometimes when I left the bathroom, I would see water dripping from their doorframe. I would watch a few drops, and I have touched the carpet to see if it was wet. It never was. I have tried to catch the droplets and watch them fall into my hands only to find them dry. I was so scared in that house that I couldn't bring myself to flush the toilet because of the noise. I was certain something would happen to me whilst the noise of the flush was filling the room. It got such that I started asking my mum to come home first thing Saturday morning because the depression and awful dark feeling in the base of my tummy got too much. I would think about going from Wednesday onward. I would worry about it and fret. I loved seeing my grandparents when they came to our home. And the dark, bleak presence of their home never followed them. Years later, my grandma got very sick, and they relocated to a bungalow. Since losing them both, I have driven past the house and no longer feel any emotion. I often wonder what this is, and I would just be interested in talking to anyone who has ever experienced anything like this. Has anyone heard of these beings? Please listen to the whole thing before passing judgment. I have seen other beings outside of episodes with and without meditation, and these felt very similar. Thank you all. Okay, just to start this off, I had a bipolar episode that led to hallucinations when I saw these things. These 2 beings were very different from the rest of my hallucinations, and I just wanted to check if these 2 could possibly have been real spirits while I know the rest were mental illness related hallucinations. As someone who believes in the occult and has certain experiences with it, I just wanted to double check on these 2 things. If anyone recognizes them, it will not affect the fact that I know I was hallucinating or affect my willingness to continue my treatment. I know 100% the rest of my hallucinations were not real, and I require treatment. Before I went to the hospital, I was in the house that does have an evil spirit. I was practicing tarot with cards that work with demonic presences and made a deal with one of them. All my friends have reported feeling an evil presence, as well as multiple people reporting being grabbed/feeling a touch in the room the ritual happened in. During the hallucinations, I saw a being clinging to the side of a door frame in the home. The best way I could describe it is that it looked very similar to the alien characters in Alien vs. Predator. But the main difference was it was all black. I felt not necessarily a fear towards it like I did with the other hallucinations. It was almost a strong unease mixed with feelings of guilt. The other being I saw was at the hospital. This was when I had not had any hallucinations for a good bit. I was looking at the wall and then saw a light gray smoke forming. It turned into 2 figures dancing together. During this time I felt no fear or discomfort. I felt almost comforted. After a bit, they stood next to each other and changed appearance. They became 2 human-looking figures that were fully transparent. The only way I saw them was an extremely thin layer of what looked like glass of their outer parts. The light was hitting their glass-looking appearance, making light look like it was weaving along the surface. I also saw a bit of purple weaving in the light. I felt an intense sense of comfort and safety with no negative feelings when seeing this. These figures were the main thing I wanted to post about because none of the other hallucinations had any negative emotions. Please let me know if these beings resemble anything you have seen or heard of. Once again, I am fully aware the hallucinations I had outside of these were due to mental illness and will continue my treatment regardless of if these 2 beings I saw could potentially be real. Thank you all. This is a very true story. About 15 years ago, I and a few friends were hanging out. We were young, dumb, and bored. Looking for any form of entertainment. Somehow we got on the subject of paranormal stories. Talking about each other's personal experiences with ghosts and/or the supernatural. Me being the clown, I was suggested playing Bloody Mary. We went to the bathroom, turned off the lights, lit a candle, and did the thing. Multiple times. Laughing. Joking and even provoking the spirit realm or Bloody Mary. To prove my bravery, I volunteered to go into the bathroom alone, close the door, and do it all by myself. Expecting my friends to obviously hold the door shut on me being well, they were shits. I countered this by going off on the mirror. Saying things like, "Come get your baby," which Duck with me. I'll slap you around and throw you back through the mirror, which? Things like that. Just being goofy really. Before I left, I spent about 5 seconds staring into the mirror looking for anything. Low-key creeped out and feeling a lot of tension rise as I stared at the image of myself looking back at me in candlelight. Until I couldn't handle it and went out of the bathroom. Nothing of notable significance happened in that bathroom. And we went on to take a shot of vodka each and kind of bullshit around for a little bit. About an hour or so had passed, and we decided to move the hangout to one of the other guys' houses. By this time it was about 2 to 3 a.m. Where we were going was about a 15 to 20 minute walk across town. By the time we left, the whole supernatural thing had completely left our minds. We were not in that gear for at least an hour. We leave my buddy's house. Go out the driveway and turn left and go about 20 yards down the street when, for some reason, I had this feeling of being watched. Like, the real deal being watched. And instinctively, I turned my head to look over my shoulder. What I saw was so evident to me I did not wait around to look at every single detail. I saw a little girl with black hair, who stood about as tall as an average mailbox, standing on the side of the road in the grass watching us leave. She looked as if she was wearing a red overcoat over a white nightgown or dress. And she had no visible facial features. The most accurate thing I could compare it to was The Ring or The Grudge. Because the hair was the first thing I noticed, besides the red contrasting the white gown she was wearing underneath. The way her hair rested was not natural at all. Almost like a cloudy, blurry, tangled mess that didn't really cover her face exactly. But it was enough to where I could tell in a matter of less than a second that what I was seeing was not natural. I immediately took off running down the street. Obviously, all my friends followed suit. And at the time I thought, no way, I've seen that. There has to be a logical explanation, and I highly doubt these guys saw what I saw, judging from how they reacted to me reacting. I kind of wrote it off as, well, maybe it was something else. I thought to myself, I'll have to come back and check in the daytime. Thinking maybe it was a mailbox or something. Again, I didn't sit there and stare at it trying to figure out what it was. It genuinely scared me to where I'd just seen it and took off. It made no sense for someone to be outside. Especially a little girl. Especially since I live in a pretty rural location. The next day or so, when I went to my friend's house, I remembered it and went to check it out, and there was nothing there to logically explain what I saw. Nothing but open field. No mailbox, not nothing. Kind of freaked me out, but still I wrote it off thinking there is just no way I saw that. This subject slept for almost 10 years. When I and that same guy were hanging out again. And we got onto that subject. Curious if he really saw what I saw or was just being reactionary to what I did. I asked him to describe what he saw without giving him any details of what I saw. His description was on point with mine except for one small detail. He claimed to see her wearing a bloody nightgown. Not a red overcoat. Kind of in disbelief, I asked him a more specific question. I said, how tall was she? Show me with your hand about how tall she stood. He ducking nailed it. Without getting any of my details on what I had seen. I am not a believer in the Bloody Mary folklore. But I do believe that certain things can happen when you do them a certain way. For instance, speaking into a mirror could be like writing to a dead relative or using a Ouija board. The whole Bloody Mary folklore is just games and bullshit. However, maybe the mirror acted as a gateway to another realm we don't understand. And maybe that night we pissed off something. And it wanted to tell us, I'm here, and I'm watching you, brats. Don't duck with me. That got me thinking. What if these silly games like Bloody Mary are actually things designed by cultists or Satanists or whatever that want to trick kids into playing a harmless game of Bloody Mary when in reality they're knocking on the door to a whole other dimension? What if it's all real? Demons, ghosts, evil spirits, etc. And what if these games were designed to allow these spirits to haunt children? Or worse even. What if it's an ancient conspiracy to release evil upon this world? To open the doors and welcome them inside our world. Without our knowledge or understanding. To this day, I've never once seen what I saw on that night again. And while a small portion of me remains kind of in disbelief, the fact that everything I saw was confirmed by a friend who was also there and obviously observed the same thing I had seen. This is not made up bullshit. I cannot stress this enough. This was a very real thing that happened on that night so long ago. I'll tell you this, writing this all now, in detail, gives me the same chills I got when I decided to look behind me that night. I feel eyes on me. Just remembering this night. I'll also say this, and it could be very well unrelated. I'm not trying to draw unfounded conclusions to crazy things that can be otherwise explained with some other explanation. However, everything has changed since that night. I cannot remember a single dream I've had that didn't involve being trapped in a house with an evil spirit that was hunting me relentlessly. Every time I dream, it's an anxiety-driven nightmare of trying to escape an uncontrollable, unpredictable force that hunts me anywhere I try to escape it. It doesn't happen every night. It only occurs when I have lucid dreams. Does anybody have a similar experience? Was this a supernatural experience? About a year ago, I had my first paranormal experience. It wasn't exactly the first time I felt something, but it was the first time it was visual, and I could hear things. First, I'd like to give some context to the story. I'm 22 years old, and my whole family has a somewhat connected history with the supernatural. I've heard various stories from both my grandmother and my mother. Especially my mother, who told me stories about her dreams and how she would talk to deceased relatives or receive messages. Despite this family history, I was never very spiritual. Okay, I had a few moments where I felt things, but I concluded that it was just my fear taking over my mind and making me imagine events that don't exist. However, around June 2023, I had two experiences that changed my perspective on all of this. The first one, which may not mean anything and could be just in my head, but after the second one, it made me think it might have been some kind of contact. I'm a university student, and I study at night, often finishing quite late, around 9:30 to 10 p.m. When I was coming back from class, going down the stairs as I usually do, listening to music, I heard a voice call my name twice. I took off my headphones immediately and thought it might be a classmate trying to tell me something I forgot or wanting to talk to me. At that moment, I went up the stairs, and when I reached the floor where my class was, I didn't see anyone there. I thought it was just my imagination, so I continued on my way home. A few days later, I was heading home again after class, had just gotten off the subway, and was on the station overpass when I saw a tall man in an overcoat pass by me. I remember observing the light that illuminated the overpass blinking repeatedly at that moment. He walked past me, and out of curiosity, I looked back, and there was no one there. I tried talking to my cousin about these two events, and he told me that our family has this spiritual side, suggesting that maybe I've reached the age where these things are surfacing in me. He told me he had similar experiences when he was my age. I don't know how much of this is true and how much is just nonsense, especially the part about the family. My cousin is a bit out there and uses a lot of weed and other drugs. He's not crazy, but he can get a bit carried away with what he says sometimes. What do you guys think? Was it some kind of real contact with the paranormal, or just in my head? Unicorn? Can't say it was. But then again, I can't say it wasn't. Recalling one of my earliest, at least one of my most vivid paranormal/supernatural experiences, I'm going to have to say I was 11 or 12 years old at the time. I'm 41 now, so yes, I'm pulling way back. I grew up in the rural hills and woods of western Pennsylvania, and this is where I lived when this event occurred. I was playing in my sandbox in broad daylight when, for no reason, all of a sudden, I had a very strong, nearly overpowering sense that I was being watched. So much so that it frightened me. On a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the most, I'd put it at a 5.5. Naturally, I stopped playing in my sandbox and rose to try to find the thing that was giving me this sensation. I would have expected perhaps a black bear, a mountain lion, a coyote, or even a stray dog even. Anything that may have naturally fit the bill. Seeing none of these expected local animals and hearing nothing in the way that would cause me further alarm, I felt more relaxed. As relaxed as an 11-12-year-old boy at the time could feel. What do I mean by this? I was always accused of having an overactive imagination. Skipping all that, I have always been alert. Especially when it came to cool things. What I now acknowledge and know to be the paranormal. So not completely satisfied, I decided to walk around my yard and the property. You know. Just in case. That is when I saw what I truly consider to be a unicorn. It was pure, stark white. White as driven snow. It stood against the colors of the surrounding summertime foliage quite blatantly. That's what got my initial attention. It was really, really white. Secondly, I took notice of its shape. It was built like a white-tailed deer. The body, legs, shape, size, and mass were no larger than a deer. Very, very deer-like. So, knowing deer, and knowing that it could have been just an albino white-tailed deer, I moved closer through the front yard to get a better perspective. In whole, if I had to guess, I would say there was 100 to 150 yards, estimated, distance between this unusually white, deer-like creature and myself. Thirdly, I noticed the tail. Even at that age, I knew then what white-tailed deer tails are supposed to look like. Anyone who grew up in deer country knows what a deer tail looks like. This creature did not have the tail of a white-tailed deer. Its tail was long, estimated, 3 feet. But it was slender, whip-like, vine-like. Almost like the shape and appearance of an African lion's tail, minus the tuft at the end. Well, this isn't right. I thought to myself, and instantly my mind went reeling. I distinctly remember seeing everything about this creature's shape and appearance. Solid, bright white, body, legs, neck, tail, and even hooves. The size of a deer, the motion of a deer, I'm sure you understand. But when it came time for me to recognize its head and face, in no simpler words, I couldn't. I literally could not make out its head. I could see its neck, because at first it had its head lowered like if it was grazing. I stood there and watched this creature for I don't know how long, and then it noticed me. Great. Now I know what it is. Paraphrased from my 11-12-year-old self, nope. It was like if a smeary, hazy, blurry veil or splotch hid the face from me, and I particularly know because every other aspect and part of it was clear to my vision. I could not make out the shape of its head, nor if it had horns, a horn, antlers, or what. I could see darker portions/spots where its eyes would be, and I could kind of sorta make out the shape of its nose and muzzle. Which, to all of my best recollection, was cow-like, or wide and squared off. I don't know because, like I remember and am sharing, this blotchy, hazy blur obscured and hid the features of everything past the place where its neck and its head met. I remember it lifting, curling, and flicking its lion-like tail as it looked directly at me, and it frustrated me then as it does now that I could not see its face. Very unusual, especially when I knew most of the local indigenous wildlife of that area. So, somewhere in a mixed state of disbelief, bewilderment, excitement, confusion, and concentration, I wanted to see this creature for as long as I could. I didn't want to startle it and scare it off, so I stood completely still. I watched it, and it watched me again. I don't know how long. A good bit, though. It relaxed its looking stance, lowered its head once more, went back to sniffing or grazing, and walked into deeper foliage that led into the wood. Calmly, unencumbered, not frightened as if to prove a silent point, we saw each other. Cool. Instantly I ran inside my home as soon as it was out of view, and I told my mother. Imagine most mothers' reactions when their 11 or 12-year-old sons come inside exclaiming that they just saw this. I told her I believed I saw a unicorn, but to no approval or avail. That didn't help me in this situation at all. But I can tell you what did. I can tell you who did. At the time we rented the property, and as it so happened, the landlord's wife was a full-blooded Native American Cherokee. A practicing one and a distinguished, well-respected medicine woman within her local social standing. I don't remember how long after my sighting it was until the time and point when I talked to her. But when I did, I told her everything pretty much in the same way as I've described it all to you. Description, color, appearance, location, movements, everything. To my surprise, she listened silently with a serene, pensive demeanor, never the once interrupting me as I spoke. At the very end of it all, she asked me, "What do you believe you saw?" Answering her, I replied, "A unicorn." She was quick and assertive to tell me, "Well then you saw a unicorn." I asked her how it was possible to see a unicorn when unicorns weren't real, remember my age at the time, and seconded it with something to the effect of, "Why would I see it when it's not supposed to be in this part of the world?" I have to smile from my heart because I absolutely love this part of the whole experience. Her answer, paraphrased: "Spirits and mystical animals can appear anywhere in the world, anytime they choose. They're not on our clock, we're on theirs. If they want to be seen, they'll be seen. If they don't, they won't be seen. Just because a certain spirit/mystical animal is supposed to be known in a specific place in the world doesn't mean that it is solely stuck or bound to just one area. You saw what you saw in the form it decided to take, at the exact time and place it wanted to be seen as." And again, I absolutely love that answer because it's just so true. Time and time again, more so than not, I know it to be true as an adult when witnessing paranormal/supernatural things. Am I claiming that her answer is the only one? No. Dare I say that because she was a Native American Cherokee medicine woman, her thoughts are correct? No. And I don't say no in any attempt to discredit any Native American belief. It was what it was, and it struck like a clear, unavoidable bell. Then satisfied in hearing her tell me what she did, I was at 100% peace with the experience. One remaining unresolved part, its head and face. Why, with all the details, could I not see that part? Let me offer you my own theory. I've always loved mythology, folklore, myths, oral traditions, legends, monsters, creatures, etc., and in my love for them, I at some point in time after this encounter decided to read up on unicorns. A somewhat worn-out school library book. Nothing more. And in my reading I discovered two aspects that answered two questions. 1. The unicorn. What I saw on that day at 11 to 12 years old nearly exactly matches the description of the Qilin. The Chinese unicorn. 2. Why I couldn't see the head, face, and its horn. Glamour. I'm sure most reading know what glamour is in the paranormal/supernatural context. It purposely blurred, disguised its head and face from me so that I couldn't make out a 100% positive identification of it. Why? Let me refer to the paraphrased quote from my landlady above. But I do know this. Most, if not all, of the beings and entities within the paranormal have this ability of glamour, including unicorns. So at 41 years of age now, I'm convinced that's what I saw. I gained nothing by trying to prove it, but it was my hope that you've enjoyed listening to it as much as I've enjoyed writing. Thank you. Please feel free to reply with any questions. I'll gladly try to answer them as soon and as best I can. In direction to this. I'm not of any Chinese or Asian descent or lineage. Then again, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if the area of land where I saw this unicorn had once been home or property to anyone of Chinese or Asian descent. Quite possibly at some point in time. I have no idea or record. I wasn't ill at the time, and I wasn't recovering from any illnesses at the time of this sighting. And I was not on any medications for any illnesses. I've never had any mental health concerns or issues. I was the sole witness to this creature. No one else in the vicinity of the sighting ever came forward to confirm a similar experience. I've only ever seen the unicorn once. My cousin had a supernatural experience. This experience occurred with a maternal cousin of mine who lives in Southeast Texas. You see, from the time I was about 3 months old up until I was about 23 or 24, my mom's family would have a reunion at a place called 7A Resort, which is located in the small Texas town of Wimberley. The reason why maternal family reunions ultimately came to an end is because 7A Resort acquired new owners. I recently looked on the 7A Resort website, and things have changed in the nearly 10 years since my mom's family stopped holding their yearly family reunions at the resort. However, I recall a particular year when one of my maternal cousins, Spencer, with whom I am particularly close, had an unusual encounter at the pioneer town 7A Resort. My cousin Spencer told me on this occasion that he was sitting outside the resort's shut-down theater and mock-up boarding house when he claims to have heard disembodied knocking in threes and what sounded like a disembodied door creaking open, and then as he passed by the resort's historic log cabin, he claims to have both disembodied gunshots and disembodied voices, and upon passing the resort's mock-up blacksmith, my cousin Spencer claims he heard what sounded like disembodied footsteps and the disembodied sounds of people working, despite him being the only other person walking through Pioneer Town at the time, while the other members of my mom's family were either socializing, taking a nap, or doing other things. And I have known my cousin Spencer my whole life. He is now a married man with 2 children, and my cousin Spencer is not the kind of person to use psychoactive drugs such as LSD or marijuana with high levels of THC, and my cousin Spencer is also not the kind of person who binge drinks or uses other illicit substances, so I know for a fact my cousin Spencer was not under the influence of illegal drugs when this incident happened. Exactly just what haunts 7A Resort I honestly don't know. All I know what my cousin Spencer told me.